I'd like to welcome everyone to the first international seminar of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation on the 50th anniversary of Lyndon LaRouche's stunning forecast of August 15th, 1971. We meet today under the title, "So Are You Finally Willing to Learn Economics?" My name is Dennis Small from the Advisory Committee of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. The LLF was founded in November 2019 at the initiative of Helga Zepp-LaRouche, just 9 months after the passing of Mr. Lyndon LaRouche in February 2019. LaRouche, the great American statesman and economist. And the stated mission of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation is to preserve and extend the monumental intellectual contributions of Mr. LaRouche in innumerable fields of knowledge and endeavor in all areas of science, politics, and statecraft. Our activities to date have already resulted in the publication of Volume 1 of the collected works of Lyndon LaRouche. I will show you Volume 1 here, and there will be more editions coming out shortly. We expect to publish Volume 2 this year. In addition to that, we have embarked on the establishment of a digital archive of the prodigious amount of work that Mr. LaRouche produced, both in the written form and in speeches, conferences, classes, and so on. This will be a digital library. It will be called the LaRouche Library. And we do hope to have available for the public the first collection on that LaRouche Library later this year. We, in addition, have launched a program of international seminars, such as this one, to extend and debate and discuss out LaRouche's activities in numerous areas. And this will, of course, just be the first of many such in the future. The first panel this morning will take up LaRouche's discovery in the field of physical economics. The second panel will explore the Earth's next 50 years. We are honored to have with us today panelists from Germany, Russia, China, Slovakia, Ukraine, Brazil, Mexico, France, Trinidad and Tobago, Argentina, the Philippines, Colombia, and the United States, as well as messages of greetings from Peru and Japan. We have an audience which is international, and you will be hearing in the question and answer period from some of those individuals who choose to ask questions of the panelists today, which will follow at the end of the presentations. This seminar is being simultaneously interpreted into Spanish, French, German, and Russian. We're motivated by science and LaRouche's unique discoveries in numerous fields. And we are also motivated by the urgency of the political moment, because ideas such as LaRouche's are urgently required to address the storm of international crises which are besetting mankind, from the pandemic to an economic meltdown, a financial blowout, the danger of geopolitical wars possibly extending to nuclear warfare among the major superpowers. And all of these crises, in effect, can be traced to the breakdown, the systemic breakdown of the transatlantic financial and economic system. This is a breakdown crisis which Mr. LaRouche not only foresaw and forecast, as you will hear in some detail today, but he also provided detailed programmatic solutions over the course of 50 years of endeavor. Now, because of the nature of this crisis and because of the urgency of Mr. LaRouche's his ideas being known and discussed internationally, we would like to underscore the famous statement made by the former president of Mexico, José López Portillo, where he said in a discussion, a public conference discussion with Helga Zepp-LaRouche in Mexico City, that it is now necessary for the world to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche. We would only add now that it is urgently necessary for the world to study the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche. And for that purpose, it is of course necessary to exonerate him and exonerate his ideas from the unjust and illegal incarceration to which Mr. LaRouche and others were subjected, in order to make sure that those ideas are in fact fully available. Now, August 15th, 1971, was a turning point in modern history. It was a Sunday, and on that day, Richard Nixon, on the instruction of his advisors and Wall Street and the City of London, took to national television to announce the end of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates and more.
Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States. In full cooperation with the International Monetary Fund and those who trade with us, we will press for the necessary reforms to set up an urgently needed new international monetary system. Stability and equal treatment is in everybody's best interest. I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators. The time has come for exchange rates to be set straight and for the major nations to compete as equals. There is no longer any need for the United States to compete with one hand tied behind her back.
And now we will hear from the man who should have been President of the United States, Lyndon LaRouche, addressing an international audience at the September 1st, 2001 conference of the Schiller Institute.
And I found myself more and more, as we got into the 60s, middle 60s, standing alone. There was nobody there to lead, not really lead. People called themselves leaders, but they were all fake. And I found myself standing alone. I just said, I got to do something. I must do something. So I did it. And some people in the room know or had some experience with what I did. Now, I was right. The first thing, I was a good economist then, a very good one, probably the best, at least on performance. You look at the past, look at what I forecast, what I taught. I was better than anybody I know today alive from that period or even today. I was the best. So I took my skills and knowledge and I just intervened on campuses and began impromptu educating young people wherever I could find them. And out of that came a movement. I did some more forecasting. And I was right. I have never made a forecast which did not turn out exactly as I specified it. Never. I've been at forecasting actually for more than 40 years. I never made a mistake in that. Well, I was also careful. I didn't forecast if I wasn't sure. Someone says, give me a prediction. I say, no. I'll give you the ones I have. I don't make these things up, on demand. I'm not like a slot machine. You put a quarter in and get a forecast out. 71, the collapse. What happened in the late 60s? A series of monetary crises leading to a breakdown of the Bretton Woods system as it now existed, unless certain changes were made. It happened exactly that way. 1967, the British pound sterling crisis. February, March 1968, the dollar crisis. 1970, the Penn Central and Chrysler crisis. 1971, the collapse of the entire monetary system. 1975, a new wave of this. Then came the Carter administration, which destroyed all regulation to speak of, destroyed everything, infrastructure upon which this country was based. And we're suffering today because of a collapse of infrastructure which has been in progress for 30 years. For 30 years, the United States has had a negative investment in basic economic infrastructure, in transportation, in urban development, in power generation and distribution, in medical care, and so forth. We have been destroying ourselves as a nation over 30 years, culturally in every other way. And I found myself standing alone. I warned against Carter in a campaign I ran in 1976, and I was right. I warned against what Carter represented and what Bush represented in 1979, 1980, in that campaign. I was right. I warned what was coming out of the degeneration of the Reagan administration in 1984 in the presidential election campaign, which changed history in this country and in the world. And I was right. 1988, I forecast the immediately following collapse of the Soviet system and outlined what had to be done about that. And I was right. But I found myself, as you know, largely standing alone, surrounded by a few friends and a few friendly souls who would agree with me. So what do you live for? Do you live like an animal to go out with a whimper? Or do you live like a human being, knowing that you are doing something, you are developing in yourself, something which will be transmitted to future generations to make humanity better in the future? You no longer are a little person living in a little neighborhood with a little mind, with little ambitions and little interests. You suddenly become a very big person because you have the minds of some of the greatest people in history before you live in you, in your replication of what exactly their act of discovery. You do things with pride to say, he was right. This was a great discovery. We've got to use it for mankind's benefit. You say, I've got to do something to make the future better for those who come after us. And I can die with a smile on my face. Because I've lived well. I've lived at peace with the greatest people of the past, or at least some of them. And I can live at peace with joy in the people of the future. I will live forever in this process. That's what it is to be human. And when you think like that, and look at other people like that, you don't have a problem. You may have problems, but that's fun. Because if problems force you to attack and solve problems, whether as an individual or in concert with others, that is fun.
And so we have our charge today, which is to have fun. Our panel this morning consists of Helga Zepp-LaRouche from Germany, Ding Yifan of China, Jozef Mikloško of the Slovak Republic, Dr. Natalia Vitrenko of Ukraine. In addition to the first panel from the second, for technical reasons, Dr. Kirk Magu of Trinidad and Tobago will speak on the first panel. Yekaterina Fyodorovna Shamayeva of Russia, Paul Gallagher of the United States, and then a presentation of LaRouche on the world stage. We will introduce each of these speakers with a bit more background as they each come up to speak. This will be followed by a question and answer period, hopefully of about an hour's duration, in which we encourage all listeners from every corner of the planet to send in their questions to the following email address: questions@LaRoucheLegacyFoundation.org. questions@LaRoucheLegacyFoundation.org in all languages. Our keynote speaker today is Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She is the founding board member of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. She is president of the International Schiller Institute. And in a word, Helga was Lyndon LaRouche's closest philosophical associate and political collaborator, and his wife for over 40 years. There is no one more qualified than she to discuss LaRouche's discovery and to carry his legacy forward. Her topic today is the Larouche Method.
I greet you wherever you may be around the globe. The history of the transatlantic world is unfolding as a drama in which it is unclear whether it will end as a tragedy or point the way to a new era of universal history. Contrary to the two-dimensional assumptions of many contemporaries entrapped in the here and now of sense perception, the current state of the world is in no way the result of natural processes, forms of historical materialism, or chance, but rather the result of false axiomatic assumptions concerning the reality on the part of important decision makers and their influence on leading institutions. We are gathered here today on the 50th anniversary of the prophetic forecast of Lyndon LaRouche on the effects of President Nixon's fatal decision of August 15th, 1971, to destroy the Bretton Woods system and replace it by a system of flexible exchange rates. LaRouche, my late husband, at the time was the only economist worldwide who recognized the systemic break in all of its implications, represented by such a switch from an economy based, despite all its imperfections of the post-war period, on scientific and technological progress to a monetarist model of economy. LaRouche warned at the time that the continuation of this monetarist policy would inevitably lead to a new depression, a new fascism, and the danger of a new world war, unless it were replaced by a new world economic order. LaRouche's forecast now seems to be born out of with terrible precision. Given the explosive discrepancy between a fragile real economy and an overhang of some $4 quadrillion of the transatlantic financial system that is moving to hyperinflation, given the blatant threat of the central bankers and bankers to, quote, shift the trillions into a global ecological dictatorship, which would lead to a massive depopulation, and given the outrageous fact that the head of the US Strategic Command, Admiral Richards, instructed in February the Pentagon to shift the possibility of a nuclear war from, quote, nearly impossible to, quote, very real. It is time to examine the methodological approach of Lyndon LaRouche. Hopefully, the world could then correct the false axioms underlying the thinking in leading institutions. Lyndon LaRouche is unquestionably one of the most productive original authors of his time. And to understand his economic method in depth, it is necessary to study the major parts of his enormous works, which the LaRouche Legacy Foundation is committed to publishing. But as an entry point into his method of thinking, the best is to begin with his own description as he presented it in his essay on LaRouche's discovery, published on November 21st, 1993. LaRouche said, "The central feature of my original contribution to the Leibniz science of physical economy is the provision of a method for addressing the causal relationship between, on the one side, individuals' contributions to axiomatically revolutionary advances in scientific and analogous forms of knowledge, and on the other side, consequent increases in the potential population density of corresponding societies. It is the application to political economy. My method focuses analysis upon the central role of the following three-step sequence. First, axiomatically revolutionary forms of scientific and analogous discovery. Second, consequent advances in machine tool and analogous principles. Finally, consequent advances in the productive powers of labor. That is, in a nutshell, the quintessence of LaRouche's discovery, which provides an unerring yardstick as to whether an idea, a technology, or an investment is conducive to ensuring the sustainable long-term existence of mankind, or whether it contributes to the collapse of society. Russian scientist Pobisk Kuznetsov considered this concept so fundamental that he was convinced it would go in the history of science under the name of La, just as other measurements were named after their discoverer, such as watt, ampere, or volt. From an early age, LaRouche was a truth-seeking mind who very quickly recognized the hollowness of accepted manners as well as the epistemological defects of various theories and convictions. Early on, he embraced the work of Leibniz, his notion of the pre-established harmony inherent in the universe and the existence of monads, which reflect in almost folded-in ways the entire lawfulness of the universe, as well as the principles of physical economy defined by Leibniz and the principally infinite degrees of freedom of thinking that arise from Leibniz's concept of the best of all worlds. Next slide. LaRouche described in his autobiography of 1988 how he, on the basis of his understanding of classical Greece, identified a clear notion of the harmonic proportions of living processes. Next slide. Here you see the perfect city and a painting by Leonardo. As it reflected in the principle of the golden section in great works of painting, sculpture, architecture, and in similar ways in poetry and music. His knowledge about the great thinkers and artists of the Italian Renaissance had taught him that all the living processes, morphology of growth, is harmonically ordered in a manner consistent with the golden section, and that ordering is a guideline for beauty, and that non-living process and that of non-living processes is not. His love of classical music and the study of the principles of bel canto polyphonic harmonic compositions from Bach to Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, as well as the acquaintance with the works of Kepler and emphatically Bernhard Riemann's 1854 published inaugural dissertation on the hypotheses which underlie geometry, had created for him a rich understanding about the neck-entropic character of the actual developing physical universe, as well as the neck-entropic character of the impact of man's discovery of those universal principles and their application in the production processes in the form of scientific and technological progress. Starting from this very rich perspective, LaRouche recognized the inadequacy of the theories of Norbert Wiener and John von Neumann and their linear statistical methods of cybernetics, information theory, systems analysis, as to their ability to communicate ideas about the real universe, the neck-entropic character of the productive economy that is one based on the continuous discovery of new physical principles and their application to the production process. Since all ideas depend on metaphorical communication of hypotheses and the meaning of discontinuities in the transition from physical principle and the discovery of the next higher principle, the conscious creation of paradoxes in the minds of the listeners is necessary. It is precisely this living principle that is left out in information theory and systems analysis. This fundamental error is in no way lessened by the fact that the systems and subsystems have become more complex over the decades since Wiener and von Neumann, and that their complexity and information processing now permeates almost all areas. Rockets and satellites sent up to space, the control of drones for remote warfare, round-the-clock supercomputing in nanoseconds all around the globe, algorithms that are supposed to predict when the people will commit, statistically speaking, a murder in what street in 5 years from now, and quantum computers that are used for data collection and analysis and for the surveillance of society. John von Neumann was perfectly aware of the extensive impact of his conceptions when he predicted, "I build something better and more efficient than bombs. I build computers." That is not to say that these highly complex systems have no useful applications. For example, to program rovers for Mars missions so that they can apparently make autonomous decisions. But the crucial question remains the moral quality of the people who program these systems, what their intention is, and what goal they hope to achieve. In addition to this unrivaled ability in terms of economic analysis and forecasts, Lyndon LaRouche had the unique ability to define historical processes and categories that beforehand appeared obscure, but became clear in his definitions. Regarding the radical positivism of the defenders of information theory, he stressed that this way of thinking reflected a constantly recurring folly that for the past 6,000 years had acted in a certain sense like a curable infection of European history. Curable because the propensity to this folly does not actually correspond to the nature of man. The foreign infection was characterized by LaRouche as an almost genetic weakness of the intellectual character of European civilization up to the present, namely a propensity to accept the oligarchical model of society. Also, specific forms of these mainly imperial oligarchical models have changed over the centuries, from Babylon to the Roman Empire, then to Byzantium, Venice, and the British Empire, and today's Anglo-American special relationship. LaRouche compared these transformations of the same system to a slime mold that changes color and shape, but remains a slime mold. In principle, the same, whether it be the viewpoint of the priest caste of Mesopotamia or the laws of Sparta's tyrant Lycurgus, until the 15th century and the image of man of the Golden Renaissance in Italy and other regions in Europe, these various forms of oligarchical model assumed that the destiny of the majority of people was to live as cattle, as cows, pigs, sheep, or chickens that can be bred to fit one's needs, used for work, and even if they become too many, can be culled. While the average Eurocentric liberal or neoliberal snobbishly puts his nose in the air and thinks he is miles above such supposedly antiquated forms of society, Lyndon LaRouche identified the essential unity between the ideology of cybernetics, information theory, and the oligarchical model. In his article, Information Society, A Doomed Empire of Evil, published on April 13th, 2000, he emblematically takes apart the confessions of Bill Joy, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, as the latter expressed them in an article in the April issue of the magazine Wired, titled Why the Future Doesn't Need Us. The subject is the scenario still rampant today in the IT community of how computer scientists succeed in conceiving intelligent machines that are faster and more efficient than their inventors, who will then become so dependent on their capability that they will ultimately have no choice but to accept their decisions. Joy reports about his discussion with Ray Kurzweil, the inventor of the first reading machine for the blind, and his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, in which he quotes the so-called Unabomber, who held the United States in suspense for 70 years with his terrorist activity. The quote is, "But we are suggesting neither that the human race would voluntarily turn power over to machines, nor that the machines would willfully seize power. What we do suggest is that the human race might easily permit itself to drift into a position of such dependence on the machines that it would have no practical choice but to accept all of the machines' decisions. As society and the problems that face it became more and more complex and the machines become more and more intelligent, people will let machines make more of their decisions for them, simply because machine-made decisions will bring better results than man-made ones. Eventually, a stage may be reached at which the decisions necessary to keep the system running will be so complex that human beings will be incapable of making them intelligently. At that stage, the machines will be in effective control. People won't be able to just turn the machines off, because they will be so dependent on them that turning them off would amount to suicide." Then, according to Joy, it would be enough to have the enormous machines operated by a small elite. The masses would be a useless burden on the system. The elite could reduce their birth rate to such an extent that most of them would disappear, and the rest could pursue some harmless hobby and leave the world to the elite. Quote, "These engineered human beings may be happy in such a society, but they will almost certainly not be free. They will have been reduced to the status of domestic animals." The methodological hideousness of oligarchical thinking that LaRouche recognized as of 1953 in the theories of Wiener and von Neumann, and that inspired the kernel of his own discoveries in his economic method, is stated openly here by Joy. From here, it's a short distance to the terrorists who believe that scientific progress and the emergence of industrialization are the source of all evil. LaRouche points to the morbid irony that Joy cites long passages from the Unabomber, from the manifesto of the Unabomber, an eccentric mathematics professor, well linked to eco-networks named Theodore Kaczynski, whom Joy does call criminally insane and a Luddite, but is nevertheless fascinated by his argumentation. In the meantime, a whole series of eco-terrorists have emerged who describe themselves as eco-fascists and who cite in their manifestos their radical ecological ideology as the motivation for their acts, such as the mass murderers of Christchurch, New Zealand, and El Paso, Texas. At a time when so many of the leading institutions of the transatlantic world are attempting to establish a global eco-dictatorship on the basis of the same radical positivist logic of cybernetics, cybernetics, information theory, and systems analysis as those of Wiener and von Neumann, it is more urgent than ever to study the economic method of Lyndon LaRouche. The Biden's administration Green New Deal, the EU Green Deal, the regime change that Mark Carney addressed at the Jackson Hole Conference in August 2019, which would take not only all monetary policy, but also all fiscal policy out of the hands of elected governments to give it to the central banks and de facto to the mega players of the City of London and Wall Street. All these systemic changes are designed to channel investments exclusively into green technologies and thus into very low energy flux density energy sources. In countless writings, LaRouche has shown the connection between the relative potential population density and the energy flux density used in the production process. If the transatlantic elite alone were to hold sway, the population both in the soon-to-be formally industrialized nations and in the then no longer developing nations would soon be rid of that useless fraction that the eco-fanatics consider too burdensome for the Earth's ecosystem. Of course, the proponents of the Green Deal do not use such crude methods as the Unabomber, but the effect is all the greater. As for the example, in the agreement between Norway and Gabon, in which Gabon undertakes not to develop its rainforest area, which is no less than 90% of the total area of the country, for a paltry 150 million euros over 10 years. One could estimate how many hospitals, schools, and industrial parks will not be built, how many children will not reach the age of 5, etc., because of that. One could also calculate by how many years the lives of people living in poverty in the United States and in Europe will be shortened if hyperinflation eats up their savings while the billionaires continue to rake it in. But of course, these are only armchair criminals or computer designers, as von Neumann noted. Hopefully, it is not too late to reorganize the hopeless bankrupt financial system by adopting the 4 laws proposed by Lyndon LaRouche and to rescue the world from the brink of the abyss of a geopolitical confrontation between NATO and Russia and China. Such a solution requires the West to understand the reasons for the relatively phenomenal success of the Chinese economic model, namely that it focuses in practice on continuous innovation and the excellent education of an enormously large number of young scientists and professionals, while spending 10% of the GDP on the cultural development of its population. This is several orders of magnitudes closer to the criteria LaRouche defined for the physical economy than it is the case for the United States or the EU, which seem determined to pursue monetarist policies to the endpoint LaRouche warned about 50 years ago. And it is not too late to bring about the cooperation among the 4 major nations, the US, Russia, China, and India, without which none of the major strategic issues can realistically be resolved, beginning with the common fight for a fight against the pandemic and the creation of a modern healthcare system in every single country on this planet. But this requires an honest reflection and the correction of the axiomatic flaws in the thinking of the past 50 years, of which Nixon's decision is exemplary. It should be a challenge to the honor of any economist why their profession has failed so remarkably to forecast the systemic nature of the financial crisis. Before the crisis of 2007-2008, many asserted that from now on the stock markets would rise indefinitely and everybody could become a millionaire. LaRouche, on the contrary, has been accurate in all of his forecasts, and that has to do with his method, which is not based on statistics and linear projections, but on what Nikolaus of Cusa called prescience, Vorwissen, previous knowledge. Since LaRouche has a clear conception about the neck-entropic character of the laws of the universe and the necessary affinity of those laws with those of the creative powers of the mind, he knows in principle what the next step of the necessary discovery has to be. In that sense, factors that determine the development or do damage to the creative powers of the minds of the workforce are much more meaningful in respect to the future productivity of an economy than monetary figures. For that reason, he was the only economist in the 60s who recognized the devastating impact of the rock, drug, sex counterculture on the creative potential of entire generations and therefore the long-term productivity of society. The GDP, on the other hand, is happy to calculate the income of drug-infested rock concerts as well as the income of brothels and tattoo parlors as positive quantities. It is that quality of prescience which explains why, with LaRouche, the science of physical economy achieved the quality of the, quote, queen of sciences, since physical economy encompasses all fields of knowledge which are necessary for the long-term survivability of mankind, i.e., all the natural sciences and all the classical arts. It is the absolute merit of LaRouche that he demonstrated, contrary to the importance given to the job specialization in modern times, that the faculties of the mind, which make great discoveries of breakthrough knowledge, are the same for both the natural sciences and great classical art. It is that same quality of prescience, the capacity for adequate hypothesis, which enabled Eratosthenes to calculate the circumference of the Earth with the help of a sundial to a 50-kilometer precision, despite the fact that nobody had ever seen the character of the planet as a sphere from space. It is the same quality which enabled Kepler to take reflections of the divine Nikolaus, as he called Cusa, a step further, and to discover gravitation as the principle accounting for the orbits of the planets. The most important distinction, however, which separates LaRouche from the bloodless accountants of their linear world of the rules-based order, who apparently have no problem wiping out millions of human beings with a click on their computer, is that he was motivated by a passionate love for mankind. In literally hundreds of his articles, he emphasized the central importance of Plato's principle of agape, of the idea of Paul's Corinthians 13 of love, of which he says that it is the only universal principle upon which true morality can be premised. This love for humanity was the guidance behind all his works in economics, be it his early infrastructure development plans for all continents of the planet, or his visionary conception about the woman on Mars and the idea of future forests on Mars. In everything he did, he was motivated by the principle that, quote, each and all members of mankind are made in the image of what Plato in his Timaeus identified as both the composer and the continuing efficient principle and personality of this universe. Some may object and ask what this fundamental conception about the identity of mankind and the principle of the universe have to do with economics. Well, as Bernhard Riemann says in his dissertation, often quoted by Lyndon LaRouche, here we leave the realm of mathematics and enter the world of physics. The chance for a positive outcome of this present era of human history may very well depend on the hope that enough human beings, economists included, understand that difference and replace the quackery of cybernetics, systems analysis, and information theory with LaRouche's science of physical economy in all universities, faculties, and textbooks around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helga, for embarking us on what should be a lifelong of study of LaRouche's discovery. Our next speaker is Mr. Ding Yifan. He is the renowned Chinese political scientist, for many years the deputy director of the World Development Institute under the State Council in China. He has written several books, which include chapters on the ideas and discoveries of Lyndon LaRouche. He was a presenter at the event releasing the Chinese translation of the EIR special report, The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which was sponsored by the Chongjiang Institute at Renmin University in Beijing in October 2015. Speaking at a conference in November 2013, he said, quote, I think that Mr. LaRouche talked about the land bridge, a Eurasian land bridge, many years ago, but his analysis is often ahead of the event, ahead of the development. So sometimes people only realize the importance of these assessments or of his forecasts several years after his projection. Close quote. Ding Yifan will speak to us today on the importance of physical economics in today's world.
Hi, everyone. I'm very honored to be able to take part into this very important event of Schiller Institute and to talk about the importance of physical economy in today's world. Lyndon LaRouche is the inventor of physical economics. When the Nixon administration defaulted in 1971 on the US commitment to the Bretton Woods system and decoupled US dollar from gold, the Bretton Woods collapsed. Mr. LaRouche forecasted the danger of excessive liquidity in the world, and 50 years later, many things predicted by Mr. LaRouche are happening. If we do not pay attention to these matters today and let them continue to develop, the world will advance in a more threatening future and bring us into a dangerous abyss. We must be aware of two incidents mentioned by Mr. LaRouche: the abuses of currency issuing and the disorderly development of the financial industry. 1. When the US dollar is decoupled from gold, the US government is easily tempted by making monetary mistakes indiscriminately. In fact, many countries have done the same mistakes. But they have all paid a heavy price for it. 2,000 years ago, under the Han Dynasty, Wang Mang usurped the power and issued new coins. He decided to mix gold in the new issued currency with brass. Prices soared. and the 1-month regime was overthrown 14 years later. After the Mongols occupied the Central Plain, they established Yuan dynasty. They found that the paper money system created by the Song dynasty, so previous dynasty, was very convenient, so they accepted it all. However, in the Song dynasty, the paper money was only a substitute for metal currencies, which facilitate commodity transaction. The Yuan dynasty turned the paper money into a sort of fiat money, and traders have to exchange metal currencies for paper money in the market before buying commodities. Marco Polo noticed the phenomena, and he noticed this in his memory, because when Venetian traders come into China, they have to exchange Venetians' golden pieces into paper money before purchasing commodities in the market. When the Yuan dynasty was short of money, more paper money would be issued to supplement the finance. Soon, the proliferation of paper money caused inflation and also insurrection everywhere in China. So Mongols has been driven back to the northern grasslands. Since the 1970s, the currency issued by the United States has flowed all over the world. As the US dollar has a unique status as a world reserve currency, the excessive liquidity of the US dollar has brought huge inflationary pressure all over the world. In recent years, the US government seems to be addicted to the use of debt monetarization. Since the COVID-19 epidemic, the Federal Reserve, Central Bank of the United States, has bought as much bonds as he had purchased since the 2008 financial crisis. When the central bank buys bonds from the market, it means in economic textbook is printing money. The consequences of printing money in such a way is easily imaginable. 2. The disorderly development of the financial industry has become the entropy of the era. Rather than a tool to provide blood for the economy. Mr. LaRouche, in the book So You Wish to Know All About Economics, used the concept of entropy in physics to describe those activities in economy that are working but cannot generate the kinetic energy to promote technological progress. Entropy was proposed by the German physicist Rudolf Clausius and refers to kinetic energy that cannot be used for work. LaRouche believed that if a society becomes entropic, it is a dissipative structure. It will consume a lot of energy without producing any real useful value, and will eventually exhaust the resources of the whole society. Since the deregulation of financial markets in 1980s in the United States, financial institutions and financial tradings has grown exponentially. Although wealth on paper have increased a lot, but has not contributed greatly to the real economy. Although the expansion of financial assets have absorbed somehow the excessive liquidity, it didn't allow money to flow into the physical market. Although it contributed to the preventing of an overall rise in prices, it created a vicious circle of boom and crash. Since then, without bubbles, the capital market cannot operate normally. But the bubble will definitely burst one day or another. Therefore, to maintain the vicious circle, we must continue to create myths and make those poor retail investors in the stock market believe that as long as they follow this myth, they can get rich overnight. Today, financial derivatives transactions have been completely decoupled from actual demand, and they are the entropy of today's economic development. Take the oil future trading as an example. The annual oil future trading is as high as more than 380 billion barrels every year, while the actual global consumption of oil is only about 36 million barrels. No, while the annual global oil consumption is only about 36 billion barrels. And the trading volume of oil future is more than 10 times that of oil consumption. Most of futures transactions conducted only by financial institutions, they don't care where the end user is. They only care about making the difference of investment. Although oil future trading is an important product in the financial market, it may not be the trade with the largest gap between futures and real products. In other words, the degree of disconnection between the virtual economy and the physical economy is very high, perhaps more than 10 times. And most of the virtual economy is idling there, and in the end, it is not transformed into real thing. This is the cancer of the world economy today. And without getting rid of this cancer, we may slip into an entropic society that Mr. LaRouche mentioned. So I will stop here today. Thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you very much, Mr. Ding Yifan, for your insightful discussion, including the issue of an anti-entropic or an entropic approach to the issue of economics. This certainly takes us, as was insisted by Riemann, out of the Department of Mathematics and into the Department of Physics. Our next speaker is Dr. Jozef Mikloško, the former Deputy Prime Minister of the first Czech and Slovak Federative Republic government after the fall of communism. Dr. Mikloško is also a former advisor to the President of the Slovak Republic and a former ambassador to Italy and to other countries. He is a professor, a writer, a tireless fighter in defense of political prisoners, and a dear friend of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. He will speak today on the topic, "The World is Waiting for the Ideas of Lyndon LaRouche."
There, Helga, Zepp-LaRouche. They are my old and new friends. Thank you for invitation to speak on this panel. Heritage of Lyndon LaRouche is a very important question for this crazy world. Lynn was a politician, an economist, mathematician, and musicologist. I hadn't met a more educated person in my life. He was a generator of new ideas, a warrior to save Christianity, family, and life. I have met him 17 times, 6 times in US, 2 times in Slovakia, and 3 times in Rome when I was ambassador of Slovakia for 5 years. In my book, Very Top Secret, I devoted about 80 pages to him. His political program was the need to produce, not speculate. Moral principles must be established in politics and in the economy. His proposed alternatives to reform the financial system. He predicted a crisis due to the destructive impact of derivative speculation. Printing money with no backing in the US and Europe today is called quantitative easing. Lynn criticized the current financial system. It's focused on through speculation, stock exchange, operations, derivatives trading. The financial market cannot be stabilized by pumping money into crisis areas, as the International Monetary Fund has been and still is doing for years. Lynn often criticized the decision of President Nixon about the cancellation of Bretton Woods agreements. He proposed the adoption of new Bretton Woods agreement, which would introduce fixed but adaptable exchange rates, the possibility of restricting convertibility if national government deem it necessary, controlling currency trade and capital movement, price and from carrying out financial speculation against selected currencies. His proposals have long been ignored. These topics has been taboo in the speeches of politicians. I became familiar with Lynn's case in 1990 when I was after Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, 2 years vice premier for human rights in post-communistic federal government. I quickly understood the many irregularities of his political persecution. It was a tragedy that at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, when it was possible to change the history, Lyndon LaRouche was in jail. I could only watch his forecasts about the West and East be fulfilled. Our friendship with Lynn began in 1993 at the prison in Rochester, where I visited him. For him, a sentence of 15 years was a death sentence. He met me in the prison with a smile and optimism. He spoke for 6 hours. He introduced Christian moral principles to politics and economics. He was a fighter for moral renewal and the saving of Christian civilization. I was always surprised about his knowledge about Mozart, Beethoven, about supercomputers, the situation in Eastern Europe, Russia and China, the protection of life, culture, and education. He was a hard fighter, but also had humor and tenderness when speaking about love and agape. He was a generator of new ideas, which are still alternatives for today's world. Lin was sentenced on December 1st, 1989, just after the Velvet Revolution. It was a political process, and 15 years in prison was the terrible decision. His 5 associates had a total of 209 years. The trials of him and his colleagues had so many irregularities that the broad international community, including myself, protested many times against it. I wrote several letters of protest to top US leaders. I visited US repeatedly with former politicians of several countries. I visited post-guarded American prisons where LaRouche collaborators were imprisoned. I am proud of contribute to his parole in 1994 and later to release of the entire Virginia Five, Mike Billington, Anita and Paul Gallagher, Lawrence Hecht, and Donald Fowle. I was very glad that in August 1994, Slovakia was the second country after Russia that Lin visited following his release in 1994. The same was repeated visit of Slovakia also in 1996. We met in House of Slovak Scientists and 120 young people from 17 countries. Mankind can tend toward unity. I remember the tears in Lin's eyes when at the fire we sang folk song. I was proud when he told me, in Slovakia I spent one of the most beautiful and happiest weeks in my life. We met also in Washington in September 1995 during the hearing investigation of the misconduct of the Department of Justice. With a committee, we fought for the exoneration of LaRouche and for the freedom of his 5 collaborators. The Commission concluded that there had been a gross abuse of inquiry and criminal violence in this process. The same situation occurred later in Wiesbaden, where Lin spoke for almost 3 hours. The new wine I bring cannot be in old skins. The culture of that is a scandal. We must start a new revolution based on love toward our neighbors. Lyndon LaRouche, the Sakharov of America, it was big dissident of Russia, was a politician with original views. When he was 75 in September 1997, a gala was held in the United States for prominent singers, musicians, and politicians. I am very glad and proud that I was the master of. At the end of my speech, I'm glad to introduce some LaRouche important ideas. Man is created in the image of God and has a highly positive worth. Everything is decided in childhood. By protecting the family we protect society. Money, counterculture, and borderless freedom produce people for the prisons. Compromise with evil and tolerance for evil must end. Commentary on lies is a lie. Let's start a revolution of Christian love without thinking about ourselves like a Samaritan. Dear friends, the world is waiting for ideas which change the end of today's situation. Especially United States and West countries are on bad tendency of hedonism, consumism, materialism, and atheism. We must explain spread lean ideas. Therefore, I suggest to publish in all languages small book about lean basic principles in understandable and simple and clear form, and distribute it in the whole world. Thank you very much for listening me, and excuse me that in years I've forgotten to speak better English. Maybe Italiano or German would be better, or Russian. All the best for you and for all countries where.
Thank you, Dr. Mikloško. And the LaRouche Legacy Foundation will certainly consider your proposal to publish in many languages a book of LaRouche's fundamental ideas. The only part that may be difficult is to make it a small book. But the point is absolutely well taken, and I certainly appreciate your unerring emphasis, as LaRouche always had, on morality and science, morality and economics being essentially a single subject, and the importance of achieving the exoneration of Lyndon LaRouche. I should also say that the LaRouche Legacy Foundation is also considering and looking for a way, and will proceed, to translate the 80 pages that Dr. Mikloško referred to in one of his books, or in various books of his, about Lyndon LaRouche. Finally, I think it might be appropriate to take the crowing of the cock in the background as a kind of wake-up call for all of us. Now let's proceed to our next speaker, who is Dr. Natalia Vitrenko. She has been a friend and collaborator of the LaRouche movement for more than half of the 50 years since August 1971. Dr. Vitrenko is chairman of the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, which she founded in 1996. She was a member of parliament from 1995 to 2002 and ran for president of Ukraine in 1999, receiving 11% of the vote, even though her campaigning was cut short by an assassination attempt. Her presidential campaign bus, driving all around Ukraine, was decked out with a gigantic poster of Dr. Vitrenko pointing to LaRouche's famous triple curve diagram, which shows financial and monetary speculation pitted against the real economy. In recent years, Dr. Vitrenko and her colleagues have courageously exposed the fascist nature of the Western-backed overthrow of Ukraine's elected president in 2014. And her topic today is Saving Mankind is a Mission Possible.
Уважаемые участники конференции.
Dear conference participants, dear Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, saving mankind is a mission possible. I have titled my presentation that because I deeply believe that if at least 3 conditions are met, tragedy for mankind can be averted. Those conditions are the following: a new Bretton Woods system, global banking reform, and providing mankind with powerful sources of energy. The world community, just as the great American scholar Lyndon LaRouche forecast, is inexorably approaching a hyperinflationary collapse, a crisis unprecedented in its scope and the threatened loss of billions of human lives. The great danger of a world catastrophe is something practically all experts around the world now agree on. At the summit of U.S. President Biden and Russian President Putin in June of this year, the problem of strategic stability was foremost in their talks. But there will be no positive results from strategic stability talks unless the fundamental problems are solved, which are causing that instability and leading toward catastrophe. These questions have to be answered. What is behind the situation in the world economy, where international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization are failing to cope with the problems? Rather, on the contrary, they are fostering and deepening the crisis. Why don't they, the world regulators, give mankind a model for a developing crisis-free society? And I am grateful to Helga Zepp-LaRouche for her universal patriotic activity to help the world intellectual elite creatively master the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche, and for organizing this conference in that context. Now, specifics on what I see as the three most important conditions for heading off the looming destruction. First, we need a new Bretton Woods system. What was adopted at Bretton Woods in the USA in July 1944 played an important role in creating a functioning world financial system. It facilitated the reconstruction of economies destroyed by the war and created conditions for the growth of international trade and cooperation in obtaining credit. Those were the declared purposes of the IMF and the World Bank. The exchange rate of the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, 31.1 grams, fixed exchange rates for the currencies of participating countries were a firm foundation for the recovery of national monetary systems. This allowed national banks the possibility of supporting a stable exchange rate for their currencies. The U.S. dollars pegged to gold made it a reliable world reserve currency. But the growth of national economies after World War II and the formation of transnational corporations, and related to that, an enormous demand for dollars, simultaneous with the USA's growing aspiration to establish world hegemony, produced the outcome that the United States itself began to subvert the fundamental principles of the Bretton Woods system. In August 1971, U.S. President Nixon announced a temporary ban on the convertibility of the dollar to gold at the official rate, thus laying a fuse under the world monetary system. At the Jamaica International Monetary Conference in 1976, that fuse was lit, with the replacement of fixed exchange rates with a floating exchange rates regime. This was a powerful impulse for the development of financial speculation, first and foremost in the USA itself, as well as in the banking systems of all the capitalist countries. Dollar emission itself was outsourced to a private organization, shares in which have a special status, the U.S. Federal Reserve System, printing paper money with a face value of $1 to $100 when it costs only 20 cents maximum to produce a bill was a profitable business. Meanwhile, the Fed's assets are growing like yeast. From 2008 to 2020, they increased eightfold, from less than $1 trillion to $7.8 trillion. And the American power elite is not greatly worried by the constant growth of the U.S. national debt, which reached $28.3 trillion as of May 2021, or 149% of GDP. The foreign debt of almost every country in the world is increasing. It increased by $24 trillion in 2020, reaching 366% of global GDP. This process is promoted by the IMF's vicious policy in line with the Washington Consensus of making loans on condition of reforms which require a reduction of the role of the state participate in national economic development, and especially in the real sector, and in social services. National economies are drained by the constant devaluation of the US dollar. As of July 20th, 2021, the low of gold on the exchanges was $1,806.20. That means that the dollar has fallen in value 52-fold since 1944. Therefore, convening a new Bretton Woods conference is an urgent necessity. The Schiller Institute has been doing enormous work to initiate this for more than one decade. In 2008, French President Sarkozy, British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and German President Horst Köhler likewise called for holding a new Bretton Woods conference to work out a new global financial system. We need a system based on multiple reserve currencies. I think that the basket of currencies could include, besides the dollar and the euro, also the Chinese yuan, the Russian ruble, British pound sterling, the Japanese yen, and the Indian rupee, bringing together the currencies of the countries that are economically the most powerful and the largest in population and natural resources potential. We need a new peg to gold as the basis for fixed exchange rates among the leading world currencies. Without question, there need to be radical changes in the policies of the IMF. Second, global banking reform. Abandoning the principles of the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference led to an unprecedented increase of bank speculation. Instead of a well-conceived credit policy with a priority on long-term credits, which are needed for developing an economy, especially the real sector, banks everywhere started turning into speculative giant squids, sucking monetary resources out of business and the population. And then these resources are put into short-term microfinancing or repeatedly sold to maximize bank profiteering. From here you get financial derivatives bubbles. The financial bubble of derivatives is now greater than $1 quadrillion, which is 10 times world GDP. The rotten financial system can collapse at any moment in a chain reaction. The scope of destruction from a collapse of the world financial system may be apocalyptic. Even now, the ongoing process of pumping up financial bubbles is leading to a continuous reduction of investment in manufacturing and infrastructure and widening the gap between wealthy and poor people. As a response to the devaluation of the dollar, the US dollar, and the related devaluation of the Labor Party and natural resources of nations, cryptocurrencies have appeared, absolutely anonymous and backed up by nothing. But a rescue of the banking system will be reasonable and progressive only if there is global banking reform. Lyndon LaRouche never tired of repeating the need for this, proposing on the model of Glass-Steagall, the Glass-Steagall law, to amputate speculative banking capital, putting an end to what he called the casino economy and making it possible to replace the monetarist system with a new credit system. That was essential to the American credit system established by Alexander Hamilton 200 years ago, which proved to be highly effective. Third, powerful energy sources. The ideologue and organizer of the socialist revolution in Russia and leader of the first socialist state in the world, the USSR, Vladimir Lenin, 100 years ago uttered this ingenious phrase: communism equals Soviet power plus electrification of the entire country. That was an astoundingly precise formulation of the key idea that human society would achieve perfection when the government was just and was of the people and for the people. U.S. President Lincoln had this idea as well. That second condition was the complete electrification of the country. Thence came the ingenious goal LOLRO plan, which became the basis for the rapid development of the Soviet economy. The question of a just government is a separate conversation, but let's now look at the issue of providing the entire planet with the energy necessary for meeting the most difficult scientific and technological challenges, ensuring economic growth worldwide, and safe and comfortable conditions of life for people. That is the task of all tasks. LaRouche did not merely philosophize about the need for constant growth of energy sources. He aimed physical economy at precisely this goal. For evaluating this process objectively, he developed the criterion of the relationship between energy flux density and relative population density, and saw the solution of this problem in providing for mankind the most reliable and cheapest energy, nuclear energy, and he welcomed the technological improvement of nuclear power reactors, insisting on the need for international cooperation in developing them and putting them into operation. We remember how LaRouche declared with emotion, "We should tear down all the damn windmills in the United States and destroy the solar panels. These are low energy flux density technologies. They mean bankruptcy." But what do we have now? Against scientific logic and the real requirements of scientific and technological progress, green energy is being spread. No attention is paid to how this suits the climatic conditions of a given country. In 2020, the Great Reset was openly proclaimed, under which the Green New Deal became the official doctrine of U.S. President Biden, openly and brutally imposed on all nations around the world. That means the developing countries first and foremost, with blandishments about fighting for climate improvement and defending the environment. Third world countries are driven into the trap of chronic energy insufficiency. This deprives them of the possibility of lifting up their national economies, defeating poverty, and stopping their population from dying out. The catastrophe in Texas in the winter of 2021 clearly showed the vulnerability of windmills and the impotence of the government to define the population, and that was in the United States. We see very well in Ukraine the artificial aggressive imposition of green energy under pressure from the West. In 2020, Ukraine's nuclear power plants guaranteed 51.2% of the country's electricity, while 35.2% came from thermal power plants running on coal or natural gas. And I stress, Ukraine has enough coal for the next 100 years. Ukraine's own natural gas extraction covers the natural gas extraction covers the country's entire housing and utilities requirements. 5.1% of Ukraine's electricity came from hydroelectric, and only 7.3% from wind and solar. But while generating only 7%, green energy accounted for 25% of the cost of electricity. The constant increase of electricity rates is an unbearable burden on practically the entire population of our country. For 30 years, Ukraine has been experiencing the destruction of material production. GDP in 2020 was only 2/3 of its 1990 level. The country's energy base has been destroyed at an even faster rate. From 298.8 billion kilowatt hours in 1990, electricity generation has dropped to 148.8 billion kilowatt hours in 2020. It has fallen by 1/2. But instead of increasing energy flux density, which would mean developing nuclear power and improving our thermal power plants, the West is twisting the arm of the Ukrainian government, forcing green energy upon us. Government guarantees big enough to bankrupt the national budget are being offered for windmill and solar panel installations, which already occupy millions of hectares of Ukraine's fertile, arable land. President Biden and German Chancellor Merkel, meeting on July 15, 2021, agreed, without Ukraine's participation or approval, to give our country $1 billion for a green fund, the purpose of which is a transition to renewable energy sources. This is a fund for the murder of Ukraine. I would like to remind you that before the destruction of the USSR, Ukraine was among the top 10 developed countries by GDP per capita. But now it is the poorest country in Europe with the lowest life expectancy. A UNICEF report this July acknowledged that 10 million people in Ukraine are going hungry. That's 1 out of 3, because there's only 30 million people left out of Ukraine's population of 52 million in 1990. What awaits Ukraine in the future? Will we be a cemetery with windmills in place of crosses? Therefore, mankind must choose: either fight for our own salvation and progressive development, or acquiesce to the horrific prospect of global destabilization and catastrophes. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Vitrenko. I failed to mention it beforehand, but I'm sure everyone realized that she was speaking in Russian with English dubbing. The international nature of this seminar both requires and permits us to do such things. Her remarks, her forward-looking remarks, as always, and the solutions which she proposes are of the greatest importance for all of our considerations. Our next speaker is Dr. Kirk Magu. He is he's the public relations officer. He's from Trinidad and Tobago. He is the public relations officer of the United National Congress, the official opposition in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. His career has spanned politics, academia, media for 3 decades, including being an independent senator. So I would like Dr. Magu to address us today on the topic of LaRouche, Development for All, and the new international economic order.
Hi, my name is Dr. Kirk Meighoo. I'm the Public Relations Officer of the United National Congress, the official opposition party in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. I'm delighted to be here at this conference in honor of Lyndon LaRouche. I'm going to speak on the topic today of Lyndon LaRouche, Development for All, and the new international economic order. In 1975, at the United Nations, Fred Wills, the Minister of Foreign Affairs from the Caribbean and South American country of Guyana, made a call for a new international economic order and an international development bank. While Fred Wills was an ally of the LaRouche movement, he also came from a tradition of Caribbean intellectual and political critique. Many from this tradition led their countries into independence in the 1960s and some in the 1970s. The new international economic order had been embraced by many in the region, including the charismatic Prime Minister Michael Manley of Jamaica. This flowed from the experience of independence in the 1960s for the larger English-speaking Caribbean countries, Jamaica in 1962, Trinidad later that year in 1962, Guyana and Barbados both in 1966. Many young people, however, at the time were disillusioned by independence. The dreams they had were not fulfilled. The economic development that they envisaged was not occurring. The type of freedom and creativity they longed for was not forthcoming from the new independent political class. Indeed, the independence leaders were seen as perpetuating neo-colonialism or neo-imperialism, and political independence was seen as insufficient or just the first step towards freedom and development. Throughout the region, matters came to a head between 1968 and 1972, with Black Power movements, trade union movements, and other protest movements sweeping up and down the islands. Some of these dissident movements came to power during the 1970s as well, while others became part of the official opposition. Our own political party emerged out of these struggles. The new international economic order was embraced and advanced by these leaders because they realized that formal independence did not mean prosperity and progress for their people. Caribbean economists like Lloyd Best, Clive Thomas, Havelock Brewster, and Latin American economists as well started looking at structural and historical reasons as to why our countries remained poor. Analysts like Fernando Enrique Cardoso saw the terms of trade being rigged against the raw materials suppliers in developing countries. Theorists like Andre Gunderfrank spoke about the development of underdevelopment and looked at the structural relationships between the center and the periphery, noting that underdevelopment was a product of exploitative relationships. This began to inform national and foreign policy of the more radicalized countries. Institutions like the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, or the United Nations Economic Commission on Latin America and the Caribbean, UN-ECLAC, were established by radical governments in Latin America and the Caribbean who wanted to deal with the structural problems of underdevelopment in the global economy. Raw materials producers' cartels were attempted on the model of OPEC in commodities such as bauxite to have more control over the exploitative, manipulated, and rigged global markets. Reform of the IMF and World Bank to include developing countries at the center had been on the agenda for decades, but consistently rejected by Europe and the US. With the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s and 1990s, and the massive debt crises which plagued many of these countries, that vision of the new international economic order faded, even within our countries where it was embraced. As a young student, I learned about these theories at the University of Toronto. Later, during my master's degree in Jamaica, I was taught by many of the advisors of these radical governments throughout the Caribbean and by the thinkers behind these ideas. In the UK, where I read for my PhD, I worked with advisors to the British government, advisors to the Reagan administration, and development policy experts who had decades of experience in the field, working with governments in the developing world and also advising the UK government on development issues. During this whole time, however, I had never heard the name of Lyndon LaRouche. But in the 2000s, I began to discover him through the magic of the internet. I discovered the vastness of his vision and the 40-year involvement he had in this struggle. I saw how he worked with Lopez Portillo in Mexico, Indira Gandhi in India, how he advocated for the industrialization of Africa and India since the 1970s, as opposed to third-class appropriate technology. He called for the establishment of an international development bank after the US dollar was delinked from gold and fixed exchange rates were abandoned. And he came up with the phrase New International Economic Order. I also saw the Fred Wills connection, and I realized that this part of history had been censored. Not even at the universities where I specialized in the subject of development studies were we taught about the theories of Lyndon LaRouche, which were not only crucial intellectually, but also practically in terms of his political mobilization. As I began to delve into his work, I read LaRouche articulate and promote the American system of economy, which interestingly went back to Alexander Hamilton, who himself was born in the West Indies. LaRouche's elaboration of the American system was fascinating to me personally, because my own intellectual mentor was one of Trinidad and Tobago's and the Caribbean's great intellectuals, Lloyd Best. One of his lasting intellectual contributions was the articulation of the plantation society and economy model, which articulated the imperial system under which the West Indies were exploited by the metropolitan countries and by local social and economic structures, and by which they remained shackled during independence, even though imperialism and colonialism had formally ended. These theories were necessary complements to each other to understand the system as a whole as it moved and developed through time and space. Best himself had begun to uncover these distinctive models before he died, but I later found them fully elaborated by Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche's analysis of the British Empire and the transatlantic system is extremely important in terms of the perpetuation of underdevelopment. The critique of the so-called free trade model of development and the focus on deep structural issues in the economy is crucial. The neoliberal models, which have dominated since the 1980s, need an effective economic counter-argument and set of policies. LaRouche's ideas must be central to that. The rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, should have naturally led to a reorganization of the world economy, and perhaps is doing so slowly, and which would take into account the needs of the developing world much more centrally. The previous moves towards this, such as the formation of the Group of 77 or the Group of 20 to counterbalance the cabal of the G7, prefigured this. But while there has been some of this change occurring and conflict brewing because of it, neoliberalism has essentially prevailed as a dominant theory in practice, and the BRICS have generally broken up. LaRouche's idea of the world land bridge, science drivers, the enhancement of productive capacity, as opposed to financial speculation, is crucial. The pandemic today and the policies of lockdown have destroyed global economic productive capacity throughout the world, which instead has been replaced with a flood of printed money. This has been central to the massive increase in wealth inequality, historic economic contraction, and an obscene transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. LaRouche's championing of the world land bridge, much of which was incorporated into the New Silk Road, is extremely important. The global four powers agreement between the United States, India, China, and Russia, the repeal of Glass-Steagall and other measures can only be adopted when one moves away from the entire discourse of neoliberalism, not only its strategy, but also its understanding of economics itself. I commend the LaRouche Legacy Foundation for carrying on this mission, which is so crucial for the full realization of the potential and capacity of the human species on Earth and in the universe itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kirk Magu, for your discussion placing the issue of the necessary development of the currently underdeveloped countries, mistakenly called developing because they're not, at the center of the issue, both morally and scientifically, of the crisis today and the issue of physical economy. As you know, and as many of our listeners know, this was at the very center of Lyndon LaRouche's life's work. And we look forward to further discussing these matters with you in the upcoming question and answer period. We turn now to the next speaker, who comes to us from Russia, who will be speaking in Russian, dubbed over in English. She is Yekaterina Shamayeva, and she holds an advanced degree in engineering and has been a senior lecturer at various academic institutions. Ms. Shamayeva has worked closely with a circle of scientists who were personally associated with the late Pobisk's Kuznetsov, the visionary Russian scientist and expert in industrial planning and management, who became Lyndon LaRouche's friend and hosted his first visit to Moscow in 1994. She will tell you about their efforts to continue the legacy of Pobisk Kuznetsov and incorporate LaRouche's science of physical economy as well. Her speech is titled Design and Management of Sustainable Development and an Interdisciplinary Synthesis of the Fundamental Ideas of the Schools of Lyndon LaRouche and Pobisk Kuznetsov.
Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги.
Good day, dear colleagues and friends.
Разрешите начать свой доклад с двух цитат.
Let me begin with two quotations.
Принадлежит выдающемуся человеку.
The first is from that outstanding person, Lyndon LaRouche,
Двух его работ.
and consists of excerpts from two of his works.
2000 года.
from an article in the year 2000. The crucial fact upon which all sound economic decisions are now premised is that the presently reigning financial and monetary institutions are hopelessly and profoundly bankrupt. And from his 1984 book on economics, the correlative of increase of potential relative population density is an increase of both the per capita and the per square kilometer increase of energy flux density, as measurable in some terms such as kilowatt degrees per square meter, a measure combining consideration of the number of kilowatts per square meter and the energy flux density as reflected by temperature equivalents at which that energy is supplied. The second quotation is from LaRouche's colleague from the USSR and Russia, the encyclopedic scholar Pobisk Kuznetsov, quote, "A transition to sustainable development requires that economic science not be isolated from physics and technology, but that they undergo a new synthesis. Conflicts that arise are a struggle for sources of energy," close quote. The ideas of LaRouche and Pobisk Kuznetsov bring together their fundamental views and the requirement for value to be linked to natural science processes and measurements. In the words of Kuznetsov, human activity needs to be brought into accordance with the laws of nature and their projection, the laws of social development, in terms of power, rising labor productivity, and the budget of social time. Turning to the topic of my remarks, sustainable, or rather sustained development. The phrase sustainable development raises many questions for any normal person. More than 30 years have passed since the approval of the principle and the concept of sustainable development, and many works have been published on this problem. As a rule, they look at various aspects of sustainable development: political, environmental, technological, energy-related, and economic. They all share one flaw: the absence of a measurable connection among the various aspects, and as a first consequence of that, the impossibility of seeing a coherent picture. And a second consequence is the impossibility of reliably designing and managing sustainable development. This problem exists not only for the concept of sustainable development. Today, the basic concepts and laws of various disciplines are incommensurate. As a result, they are not interconnected or are interconnected in some undetermined way, which gives rise to a mental failure to understand the actual connections within the real world and creates an illusion of their independence, a world of false values, and it aggravates the professional failure to understand actual problems and forces people to make mistakes, leading to a global crisis. It is fundamentally wrong to view society's sustainable development separately from the laws of nature, since that strips the idea of any lawful basis. The central idea in the works of Pobisk Kuznetsov is the law for the development of life as a cosmic and planetary process, as the fundamental law of all open socio-economic systems. His collected scientific works, published in 2016, is titled The Science of Development of Life. To date, 5 volumes have come out in Russian. The development and application of Kuznetsov's ideas gave economic science a new method for formulating knowledge on the basis of natural science. The scientific works of Pobisk Kuznetsov were based on the discoveries of Podolinsky, Vernadsky, E.S. Bauer, and other scientists. In the course of many years of fundamental and applied work, the P.G. Kuznetsov Scientific School was formed, and it is represented by Boris Bolshakov, Viktor Belyakov-Bodin, Viktor Kapustyan, Andrei Petrov, Vyacheslav Chesnakov, Alexander Armensky, and others. too numerous to list in this short report. As of today, this scientific school has shown that underlying the generally accepted principle of sustainable development is a general law of nature, the law of conservation of power or energy flux, the discovery and application of which is linked with the names of Lagrange, Maxwell, and Pobisk Kuznetsov, and its projection, the principle of conservation of the development of living systems, described by Vernadsky and Bauer. These principles postulate for development a non-decreasing growth in the efficiency of utilizing society's net capacity or usable power, its resources, interacting with the environment. On the basis of these fundamental laws and principles, a system of models has been developed on the national and regional level, which make it possible to design and manage changes in society on a lawful basis, viewing sustainable development as a projection of the general laws of nature onto particular systems of coordinates. And this is especially important in the difficult conditions of the world today, and it's no surprise that the ideas of LaRouche and Kuznetsov continue to animate the minds of scientists, educators, and politicians because they provide a fundamental organizational basis for a way out of the crisis, for preserving and for the possibility of developing mankind. LaRouche and his team have produced strong practical solutions and organizational and political recommendations, and there has been cooperation between these two schools in response to requests and needs in the framework of scientific research programs. There have been meetings, including between LaRouche and Pobisk Kuznetsov, seminars, scientific conferences, and from 2013 on, presentations by LaRouche and his associates became a regular part of the annual International Conference on Fundamental and Applied Problems of Sustainable Development in the System of Nature, Society, Man. There are presentations on such topics as the world crisis and fundamental contradictions in world development, prospects for preserving the development of mankind in the face of global challenges, and the strategic significance of the New Silk Road were warmly welcomed by the Russian scientific community and youth. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the ideas of Kuznetsov were integrated into educational curricula. In early 1999, the Dubna International University of Nature, Society, and Man was founded, including a Department of Sustainable Development, and later a Sub-Department of Sustainable Innovative Development was established, which brought together several leading scholars in the Kuznetsov school. The purpose of this sub-department was to train people in fundamental and applied knowledge for the design and management of development on the basis of the natural science laws of development of the system nature, society, man, and skills training in the use of methods based on the general laws of nature expressed in universal spatio-temporal, or LT, parameters. This is a unique work in this regard are those of Roberto Bartini, which was synthesized with the works of Kuznetsov. In the course of their studies, students are introduced to the scientific heritage and its applications, including the foundations of physical economy and the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche. The director of this educational program, which was called Design and Management of Sustainable Development, was Boris Yevgenievich Bolshakov, who for more than 20 years engaged in teaching, scientific research, and educational work with the public, conveying these unique scientific ideas to younger generations. He also made and published several outstanding discoveries, such as his unique work, The Law of Nature, or How Space-Time Operates, which presented the fundamentals of LT physics, LT chemistry, and economics. In 2018, Professor Bolshakov passed away, and the educational work he had directed underwent big changes. But today there is a unique organizational tool for the development of these ideas, a public organization called the Space Society, as in outer space, under whose umbrella various educational, engineering, and organizational projects are being done, including those related to the above-mentioned scientific schools. As for me, I represent the area concerned with designing regional development in terms of natural science measuring tools. derived from the law of conservation of power. This involves multi-country applied models in terms of power by which it is possible to evaluate the equivalence of exchange between countries. There are also interregional models within a country for evaluating living standards and the quality of life in terms of power. We also model technological trends and possibilities for development, which requires formalizing and evaluating innovations using both value and natural science measuring tools. I work with several youth groups on developing criteria and evaluating the budget of social time, both for the country and for macro regions, as well as technologies for organizational planning and management based on the Scalar system. Authors were Kuznetsov, Pobisk, and the management systems for Systems Developers Laboratory, LaRouche's, at the Moscow State University for Instrument Making and Informatics. We provide the multi-level statistical database necessary for modeling power systems. Thus, we have a developed theory, methodology, and technology for the design and management of sustainable development of systems at various levels, all based on universal natural science parameters. What's especially needed today is new methodological guidelines, practical solutions, and applications as a synthesis of the fundamental ideas of these two scientific schools. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this seminar and the representatives of Lyndon LaRouche's school for inviting me and for our ongoing collaboration and responses to our work. Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for your attention.
Благодарю за ваше внимание к докладу.
Thank you for your attention to my report.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shamayeva, for your very important discussion of the role of Pobisk Kuznetsov and opening the door for what I think will be very, very productive further discussions in terms of LaRouche's concepts and Kuznetsov concepts. This kind of cross-fertilization of ideas, I think, is at the very heart of the advance of science itself and points to the not only foolishness but suicidal nature of those who would try to obstruct such free exchange of ideas in the scientific realm, arguing geopolitical considerations. Our next speaker on this morning's panel is Paul Gallagher from the EIR editorial board and its co-editor for economic affairs. Paul is one of the first members of Lyndon LaRouche's first youth movement from back in the late 1960s, and he has played a leading role since then in spreading and elaborating on LaRouche's science of physical economy. He has published and spoken extensively on physical economy, economic history, and scientific issues. He is also, like LaRouche, a former political prisoner. Paul will address us this morning on the early economic forecasts of Lyndon LaRouche.
Lyndon LaRouche's early economic forecasts. At the start of 1957, Lyndon LaRouche made a very accurate forecast in a privately circulated study of the recession of August 1957-58, the most significant recession in the post-war period and one not expected by economists at all. Then, beginning in 1961, with the published article headlined "Depression Ahead," LaRouche began to forecast the breakup by the end of that decade with a potential consequence of economic depression of the Bretton Woods system, what most people understood as the dollar-gold system. When Bretton Woods was broken up at the start of the 1970s, it became widely known among liberal and left economists, and also American university and graduate students radicalized by the Vietnam War, that Lyndon LaRouche uniquely had been warning that this was coming. These forecasts by Lynn came from his view of the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt and his knowledge that the Bretton Woods credit system, in which the United States was the dominant economy with the reserve currency, was not the Bretton Woods that Franklin Roosevelt intended in creating it. In 1945, Lynn had warned fellow soldiers in the Burma-India theater when FDR died that the shift to the little man, Harry Truman, meant a fearful period for the United States. He had watched his fellow returning veterans quickly forget FDR's mission of remaking the post-war world without colonies and with 20th century, not British 18th century methods. When he began his studies on the US economy in the 1950s, LaRouche confirmed that the American economy was not focused at all on capital goods exports to underdeveloped nations. And this was degrading capital formation. It lowered the economy's productivity from the industrial infrastructure of FDR's great projects and war mobilization. For a long time afterwards, he insisted that the economic failure of Eisenhower's administration, with Ike equaling Truman's 2 recessions in 2 terms, was that it did not follow through on that post-war mission and export capital goods for development as we had exported machines to win the war. The World Bank under Wall Street capo John J. McCloy, appointed by Truman, did not make low-interest loans for great projects in the Third World. Eisenhower's economic policy pushed domestic consumer credit and an American consumer goods boom. U.S. Census Bureau reports showed that American exports of manufactured goods in 1955 at $8.6 billion in value were 30% lower than they had been in 1950. They were still 20% lower in 1960. The U.S. trade balance in manufactured goods was, of course, positive in that period, but it was plus 5% of American GDP in 45, plus 3.5% of GDP in 1950. I'll skip the intervening constant decline. It disappeared entirely before 1970. Credit was going elsewhere. Mortgage loans issued went from negligible in 1950 to 57 billion in 1960. Auto loans issued went from essentially zero in 1950 to 16 billion in 1960. Cars on the road from 30 million in 1950 to 80 million in 1955. It was in analyzing that auto sales credit bubble, the bust of which was about to hit both car manufacturers and dealers, that Lynn saw the 1957 recession coming. U.S. auto production was 5 million vehicles in 1950, 8 million in 1956, but back down to 5 million in 1958. And auto then employed 15% of the entire workforce. Later, LaRouche called his recession forecast, quote, a study of longer-term capital formation trends completed in February of 1957, which forecast the forthcoming recession to occur that year as exceeding those of 1947 to 49 and of 1954, and to persist for an extended period, unquote. More extraordinary was his first published forecast, long-term, Depression Ahead in 1961, which he said was intended to be the first of 3 studies in the International Socialist Review. That journal cut relations with him, and he completed the study in his 1967 Third Stage of Imperialism, the first mass publication of his own independent movement. With that Depression Ahead, LaRouche began to forecast not only the fateful economic events of the 1960s, leading to the Bretton Woods breakup, but also their impact on society. The U.S. economy's concentration on its own consumption would end surpluses of goods trade, which were important to the dollar's global reserve function. And indeed, the American goods trade surplus disappeared in the late 1960s. There would be, quote, an inevitable impulsion towards adoption of Schachtian economics, unquote, in the United States and European nations. This meant Hitler's central banker, Hjalmar Schacht's policy, an austerity policy involving steady, indefinite ratcheting downward of real wages. And there would be, quote, a new kind of approach to the underdeveloped sector, unquote. That approach, the transfer of production of some industries from industrial nations to what essentially were Schachtian work camps in the Third World, was the subject of LaRouche's criticism in The Third Stage of Imperialism of 1967. This serious attack on globalization appeared long before that term was invented. Just as important, LaRouche noted that, quote, the leveling out of the rate of technologically oriented expansion of U.S. industrial plant and employment capacity meant a drastically lowered rate of assimilation of racial minority strata, unquote, that is in the workforce. He wrote there was, quote, a demoralizing shift of high school and university graduates' post-matriculation employment prospects away from production-oriented jobs. And this, he forecast, meant that many strata of youth would be radicalized in the United States and Europe in the 1960s, but working people only later in response to real deterioration of economic conditions. This pre-Vietnam insight was perhaps the most extraordinary early forecast LaRouche made. It defined his strategy for starting his independent political movement. Find radicalized students and graduate students of above average discernment and commitment to the welfare of others. Teach them his method of economics to prepare them to be able to show radicalized working people their common interest with the unemployed and the working people of the underdeveloped nations. The third stage of imperialism intended that anti-Vietnam War students should recognize the Shaktian fascist policy underlying such a fundamentally colonialist war. They could organize for a policy of third world industrialization and development projects. This could make common cause with those students' political antagonists, namely American and European skilled workers, who didn't realize how or why their job and wage prospects were heading south to Shaktian labor camps. One of LaRouche's first campaign posters was, quote, this man can get you a job rebuilding the world, unquote. LaRouche's 1961 article had already forecast that a series of monetary crises by the end of that decade were likely under continuation of U.S. monetary policy and would lead to the breakup of the Bretton Woods fixed currency gold reserve system. The pound sterling crises of 1966 and 67, leading to the uncontrolled 15% devaluation of the pound in November 1967, turned out to be the trigger. In the post-war period, the British had maintained their colonial imperial trade preference system and their pound sterling bloc within the dollar-based Bretton Woods system. And starting in the late 1950s, London banks blatantly violated the Bretton Woods rules by opening high-interest accounts for dollar deposits in London, then creating very high interest rate, actually unpayable dollar debt of third world countries, the so-called Eurodollar loans. This was the diametric opposite of Franklin D. Roosevelt's intended policy at Bretton Woods toward the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian colonies as they freed themselves. The huge pound devaluation put great pressure on the dollar, already weakened by the near abandonment of FDR's capital goods export policies, the resulting collapse of the U.S. goods trade balance, and inflation. LaRouche frequently attacked Arthur F. Burns, the political conservative but liberal Keynesian economist, Milton Friedman's teacher and mentor, head of Eisenhower's Board of Economic Advisors, and Nixon's Federal Reserve Chairman. As the last, Burns simultaneously raised the money supply rapidly during 1970-71 while pushing for wage and price controls until Nixon imposed them in August 1971 after breaking the dollar's link to its gold reserve. Those wage controls and that Shaktian fascist policy to the underdeveloped countries were the main issues in Lynn's famous debate with Professor Abel Lerner of NYU in December 1971. Professor Lerner was considered the most brilliant of living Keynesian economists. In the debate, he supported Nixon's action, supported the wage and price controls, and finally, under the pressure of LaRouche's reasoning that this would lead to Shaktian fascism, Lerner supported Schacht by name before an audience of hundreds of New York students and teachers, college students and teachers. It has been noted that Lyndon LaRouche's reaction to the vindication of his economic forecast and method by these events was to organize his own intelligence system and launch an intelligence service known as Executive Intelligence Review. Consider EIR's leading preoccupations in the first years of the 1970s in economic coverage were toward the formation of the European monetary system, the so-called golden snake of fixed exchange rates in the European Economic Area, toward creation of an international development bank, Lynn's concept adopted by the non-aligned nations in 1976, toward the United States issuing gold-backed industrial development bonds at $500 per ounce of gold. What were these but LaRouche's organizing steps towards recreating Bretton Woods as FDR intended it to function? Since the beginning of what he called his 3 phases of economic studies in the 1950s, LaRouche's understanding of the urgency of FDR's goal was fundamental to all his extraordinary forecasts.
Thank you, Paul Gallagher, and for an actual demonstration of the fact that the forecasts by Lyndon LaRouche are actually the best prism through which to understand the actual economic history of the last half century. We now turn to our final presentation before beginning our discussion period, which will occur with the panelists, and this last presentation is about LaRouche on the world stage. Lyndon LaRouche was a central actor on the world stage over the last half century, far more than most Americans realize, and far more than his opponents would like to admit. His ideas profoundly penetrated leading political and intellectual layers around the globe, even when they disagreed with some or even most of what he was saying. In addition to the wide circulation of his writings and video conferences, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche personally visited over 40 countries where they met with hundreds, if not thousands, of leading figures. Are you aware of the fact that Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, along with a couple of their direct envoys, met with some 24 heads of state and government from 20 countries over the years? From India's Indira Gandhi to Mexico's José López Portillo, France's Michel Rocard, Israel's Abba Eban, and Ronald Reagan of the United States. There are among them sterling individuals who would be here speaking to you today, but for the fact that, like Lyndon LaRouche, they have passed away. And so we decided to make sure that their voices were heard in recorded form to conclude this morning's discussion of LaRouche's ideas. We begin with an American, Ramsey Clark, the former Attorney General of the United States under Lyndon Johnson, who was also LaRouche's attorney on appeal of his railroad conviction in the Alexandria rocket docket in 1988. Clark here addresses the August 31st, 1995, independent hearing on misconduct by the U.S. Department of Justice, which investigated the LaRouche and other legal atrocities in this country.
But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently, This case takes the prize. The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas. A common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost. In the LaRouche case, they're book people. I have to confess to the intellectual weakness. I find reading easier than thinking, so I read constantly. Nearly blinded myself from too much reading. Got 15,000 books at home. Read most of them, unfortunately. As you can tell, I haven't learned much, but I haven't stopped yet. These are book people. They had publishing houses going on. Important publications, non-profit stuff. The government comes in and these are just some of the peripheral things that Odin and others might not have explained to you. But these are what they were about: ideas, information, social change, meeting the needs of human people all over the world, humanity all over the world. We're going to have 1 billion more people before the end of this millennium, century, decade, and the vast majority, 80% or more, are going to have beautiful darker skin, and they're going to live short lives of sickness, hunger, pain, ignorance, and violence unless we act radically. And these books have ideas. Some will work, some won't work, but they're ideas. They can be tested in the marketplace, as we used to say.
We travel next to the city of Sao Paulo, Brazil, where on June 12, 2002, then U.S. Democratic Party presidential pre-candidate Lyndon LaRouche was awarded honorary citizenship for Sao Paulo by the city council of that city of more than 18 million people, the third largest in the world. LaRouche was invited to Brazil to receive this honor by Dr. Avanir Nimtz, the principal representative on the Sao Paulo City Council of Brazil's Prona party, founded by Dr. Enéas Carneiro, one of Brazil's preeminent cardiologists and a former presidential candidate. Less than 4 months after hosting LaRouche's visit, Dr. Enéas was elected to Brazil's National Congress with the largest vote total ever achieved by any candidate in the entire history of Brazil.
Quem é Mr. LaRouche? Who is Mr. LaRouche? Mr. LaRouche não para em matemática.
Mr. LaRouche doesn't stop at mathematics. He discourses with an exceptional fluency in matters of the physical world, speaking with intimacy and profundity about the ideas of Gauss, Ampere, Ørsted, and Kepler, and so many other great men of physics. When we turn to philosophy, there the man is really something else. From Plato to Leibniz, from St. Augustine to St. Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, Spinoza, the depth of his analysis is enough to leave any one of us with our mouth open. He speaks about ancient history as if he were seated on the sofa at Plato's symposium. It's as if he had been sitting at their side. He who reads Mr. LaRouche's articles receives a refreshing shower of science, art, and philosophy. But beyond such incontestable knowledge, what most impresses me about Mr. LaRouche is his social concern, is his concern for the fate of humanity.
Another world leader who worked closely with LaRouche was the former Foreign and Justice Minister of Guyana from 1975 to 1978, Fred Wills, who was one of the most courageous leaders of the fight for a new world economic order. He called for LaRouche's proposal for a new international development bank from the floor of the United Nations General Assembly on September 27, 1976. And in 1984, he became one of the founding board members of the Schiller Institute. On matters of scientific physical economy, I cannot fail to mention the preeminent Russian scientist Pobisk Kuznetsov, who was discussed in an earlier presentation today. Kuznetsov was so taken by his personal discussions with LaRouche in Moscow in mid-1994 that he shortly thereafter proposed that an actual unit of measurement of the physical economy related to potential relative population density should be named after him. Quote, "Let us introduce the physical magnitude of a LaRouche, designated by La, which gives the number of persons who can be fed from 1 square kilometer or 100 hectares during 1 year. We share LaRouche's view that the magnitude of potential relative population density can serve as an indicator of intellectual culture." Close quote. Our final guest is the former president of Mexico, José López Portillo. Over the period of his 1976 to 1982 presidency, López Portillo grew to respect and admire U.S. statesman Lyndon LaRouche, with whom he met personally on May 23, 1982, in the presidential palace in Mexico City, and the movement of youthful Mexican patriots associated with LaRouche, in whom López Portillo saw the best hope for Mexico's future. As the ex-president himself put it in an exclusive EIR interview on September 17, 1998, quote, "As president, I had a relationship with Mr. L.H. LaRouche of respect for his solidly independent and tenacious ideological position, which I share in large measure, largely because of the adherence he had achieved from a group of young Mexicans whom I equally respect and admire." Close quote. So, as I'm fond of repeating, if you want to educate a president, organize a youth movement. A year later, on November 18, 1999, López Portillo issued an open letter calling for support of LaRouche's presidential campaign. Quote, "I would like to recognize the tireless and generous efforts carried out by Lyndon LaRouche, for whom I hope for the best as a pre-candidate for the presidency of the USA. I wish that his voice be listened to and followed by those in the world who have the grave responsibility of stopping this situation from continuing on its calamitous course, and I hope that his fellow U.S. citizens, who will elect their president in the coming elections, will give him their timely recognition and support." Close quote. And on December 1, 1998, López Portillo stated the following in response to the keynote address given by Helga Zepp-LaRouche at their joint seminar at the Mexican Society of Geography and Statistics in Mexico City.
Yo felicito a doña Helga por estas palabras.
I congratulate doña Helga for these words,
Impresionaron especialmente,
which impressed me especially because first,
me encerraron en el Apocalipsis.
They trapped me in the apocalypse, but then she showed me the staircase by which we can get to a promised land.
Muchas gracias, doña
Many
Helga.
thanks, doña Helga.
Doña Helga,
Doña Helga,
y en esto
and here I wish to congratulate her husband,
Lyndon
LaRouche.
Y ahora es necesario que la sabia palabra de Lyndon LaRouche se escuche en el mundo.
And it is now necessary for the world to listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche. Now it is through the voice of his wife as we have had the privilege of hearing.
Que es importante que nos ilustren respecto de lo que está pasando en el mundo.
How important that they enlighten us as to what is happening in the world, as to what will happen, and as to what can be corrected. How important that someone dedicates their time, their generosity, and their enthusiasm to that endeavor.
De mi parte, Yo cumplí un periodo de responsabilidad.
For my part, I fulfilled a period of responsibility.
De alguna manera dramática.
And I can report in a somewhat dramatic way what happens to national economies in an international financial order such as that which has ordered our affairs since Bretton Woods.
To which we can only add that it is now necessary to not only listen to the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche, but to study them as well. We have now had a shower of ideas, as Dr. Eneas Carneiro referred to it. We turn to our question and answer period, and we will shortly be bringing up our panelists to join me on the podium, the virtual podium for this. So be prepared for your cameras to go on. The question and answer period, we have just under an hour to be able to explore many of these ideas. I will tell you that I'm going to give precedence to questions that come on the subject of LaRouche's discovery, which is in fact the topic of this panel. But of course, any questions are welcome to any of the panelists or to all of them. A few of them will not actually be able to be on the panel today because they live in very, very different time zones and couldn't make it, and other technical reasons. But we thank them for their contribution nonetheless. Let me also, just before we begin the Q&A session, mention that we have greetings internationally for this conference from, among others, Dr. Carlos Gallardo, the president of the Christian Democratic Party of Peru. We will be presenting that video greeting a little bit later in this afternoon's program, as well as from Daisuke Kotegawa, a high official formerly of the Japanese government in the finance ministry, as well as their representative to the International Monetary Fund. The panelists who will be joining us today can hopefully now appear on the screen. I believe we will have, of course, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We will have Jozef Mikloško. I see him as well. We have Paul Gallagher, we have Yekaterina Shamayeva, and we have Kirk Magu. Great. So we are all joined here. I am going to begin, just to get the ball rolling on this, to ask each of you, beginning with Helga, for any brief comment that you might have on the various presentations or the direction in which you think that this discussion would most proceed. So Helga, please.
Well, first of all, I want to greet all of you, all good friends, and I appreciate all the more, what you are doing in discussing the ideas of Lynn, because, it is really very, very difficult because, I was just thinking he passed away 2 years ago and he was 97. So he would be 99 years old now. And a lot of people who appreciated the extraordinary work of this man, were of his generation or even, older. And naturally, most of them are no longer with us. So I think it is very, very important that, we join here together and, you bring your different angles and levels of understanding on, the significance of this, so that we can hopefully relaunch a renaissance of LaRouche thinking. Because, I also like very much, Joseph, what you said about the little booklet. This will be difficult because Lynn's ideas are so voluminous that it will be very difficult to put them in a little book. But I agree. I think, we should really consider that. If we would have such a little book with some of the most important ideas in all languages, about 200 nations, but many more languages, I think it could be a Paukenschlag. So maybe, we should come out of this meeting with such an initiative, because I really think the world is in such a dire need of these ideas. And therefore, I'm really thankful that you all participate in that. Thank you very much.
And perhaps we would be willing to commit ourselves publicly at this point to making sure that little booklet is in fact published on the occasion of what will certainly be a LaRouche Legacy Foundation seminar on the 100th anniversary of Lynn's birthday. Dr. Mikloško, could we have some comments from you, please?
Yes. Thank you. I was surprised that Helga today spoke about informatics, about cybernetics, about Wiener, about all this coryphée which start to make this progress in computers. It is very near to me, and therefore, because I was 27 years on our highest Institute of Technical Cybernetics, where really it was in communism time, it was the only possibility to do something reasonable to science, and mathematician was very not usual to used by communists, which had some more ideological, political topics. Therefore, I could understand, maybe better than others, also in America and Germany, that Lynn really was good prepared in mathematics. I was always surprised when I saw that many algorithms, many theorems, many topics in mathematics are only in numerical analysis, informatics, complexity, and some other topics, but there are hundreds of topics in mathematics, and Lynn was really very good informed about many topics in mathematics. Second remarks, these booklets, I think today the people are lazy to read too much. Maybe 50 pages, not explanation, very long, but only basic suggestion for the world. What should be done? Maybe why can be also right, but not so very long. I have one big castle here where I have about 40 Lynn books, but there are 300, 400, 500 pages, and probably this explanation and some good reduction could be done for the future, and this 50 till 100 pages book would be very, very interesting. Thank you.
The challenge is enormous, but we will take it up, especially since it will be combined with making available the entire corpus of LaRouche's work in a digital library in the LaRouche Library. Now I'd like to ask Dr. Kirk Magu for his brief comments on the subjects under discussion today. Well, we can't hear you. I don't know if the problem is at your end. There we go. No, you're fine. We can hear you now.
There. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Sorry, good morning to everybody, but I just realized that we have people from all over the world, so whatever time of the day it is, a pleasant good day to you all. It was, I really found the presentations to be excellent, and the very nature of the global reach and of this conference is so important to the theme I was discussing and Lyndon LaRouche's work in terms of global solidarity. That for a truly global movement, something with truly global effect that Lyndon LaRouche was fighting for and wanted to produce, he went out and made international alliances, and it is so important that this continues. And then for people like us, let's say in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, from small societies, very concerned about our own development, of course, and the development of the world. But we have a special concern about our own development, obviously. It is very heartening and encouraging to know that we have allies around the world. Because even in our own countries, people have given up the struggle and have simply fallen in line with the dominant models. And so these prescriptions, these conferences, this movement, some of the excellent suggestions I heard today, which were very stimulating to me. This type of solidarity, global solidarity, is so important for a small country like ourselves to know that we have allies in the larger countries. But I also want to say the reverse is true, in that although we are small countries, in fact, because we are small countries, we have a disproportionate role in, say, institutions, voting institutions, let's say like the United Nations. The English-speaking Caribbean, for example, has 13 votes. And we are, when you add our populations together, it's 5 million, which is less than a large city, in North America or Europe. Yet, on the United Nations stage, we have 13 votes in CARICOM, which is a Caribbean community. And therefore, the alliances work both ways, that if our people mobilize as well, we can push forth these agendas, which is how things like UNCTAD and ECLAC came about before, and LaRouche, program with the 4 laws, etc., being put on the international stage, requires this solidarity, which is reciprocal. And I just want to say that I look forward to working on these things together, to being in personal contact with the people here in this panel, because I definitely want to follow up with some of the ideas mentioned.
And so we shall, to be sure. I'd next like to ask Yekaterina Shamayeva if she has any comments. Let me advise our listening public and remind our panelists as well that there is simultaneous interpretation going on into 4 different languages for all the listeners. But when we have in this case, Russian-speaking panelist, the responses will be done in consecutive interpretation. So we request your patience and for Ms. Shamayeva to respond, leaving time for her interpreter to render her words into the English language. Ms. Shamayeva, please.
Добрый день. Могу я тоже высказаться?
Good afternoon. I would like to speak.
Pobisk Kuznetsov предложил комплексную единицу измерения Ла.
Kuznetsov suggested to
Сегодня это не просто есть единица измерения, а модель или параметр, который мы называем качество жизни человека.
To change what is not just union or something, but it's the quality of human life.
Этот параметр измеряется в единицах мощности на человека.
Which is measured in power units per person.
Имея такую мощную научную базу Побиска, Кузнецова и Ларуша, в этом наше большое преимущество.
And we have the advantage of a powerful scientific base of Pobisk, Kuznetsov and Lyndon LaRouche.
Сегодня, прослушав интересные доклады, я хочу сказать, что идеи Линдона Ларуша можно назвать космоносферными в духе идеи Владимира Ивановича Вернадского.
In having listened to all the presentations today, I can say that the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche can be called cosmospheric in the spirit of Vladimir Vernadsky.
Который, я хочу напомнить, в 1941 году написал.
Who wrote, as I would like to remind you, that in 1941,
мы переживаем не кризис, волнующий слабые души, а величайший перелом мысли человеческой.
We are not going through a crisis which worries those who are weak at heart, but the greatest breakthrough or turning point of humanity.
И находясь на этом переломе, мы должны быть счастливы.
And we are happy to be there. We should be happy to be at this point.
Что можем развивать науку.
That we can develop science.
Поэтому сегодня я считаю одной из важных задач объединять наши усилия для развития дальнейшей научной фундаментальной базы и внедрения научных идей в практику.
So I believe that today it's very important for us to unite our efforts in uniting the fundamental scientific base and to enter scientific ideas into practice.
На самом деле эффективность любой политики зависит от ответа на вопрос, что и как мы измеряем, чтобы сделать нашу жизнь, жизнь человека лучше.
And the efficiency of all politics, of all policies, is in asking and answering the question of what and how we are measuring to improve in order to improve the human life.
И в наших совместных работах есть ответ на этот вопрос. Спасибо.
Our joint work will be the answer to this question. Thank you.
And thank you very much. Next, I would like to ask Paul Gallagher for his comments to this point, please.
I would just say that I think Lynn would really have liked this discussion, although I'm sure that at this point he would be telling us the things we left out, the most crucial things that we left out. But nonetheless, I think that he would really have liked it in that it was a really powerful presentation of attacking the enemy, and Lynn always did that in the way that Helga did it with the potential threat of an actual capitulation of the human race and its powers of reasoning to computer systems analysis, which were obviously partway suffering already, and the machines are getting smarter, supposedly. The people probably in proportion are getting dumber, but that really identified the enemy. And there was all of this discussion of development, which and the details of and the moving forces of development, which I think is really important to everything that Lynn ever did. I had a question for Dr. Vitrenko, but I'll try to communicate that in another way to her. And otherwise, I was going to ask Kirk if he could say a little bit more about, maybe not immediately, but in the course of the discussion, about Lloyd Best and the relationship that he sees between Lloyd Best's teaching and Lynn. It's just someone that I had never heard of, who sounds to have been very valuable.
Okay, very good. Certainly one of the things which I forgot was to mention something quite important, which to express our great appreciation for the entire technical staff, the AV staff, the interpreters, and so on, who are crucial to making events like this possible. It only looks easy, and that's because of all of the immense work that is going on behind the scenes. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and address a very simple, but I think crucial question to Helga LaRouche and then anybody else who would care to respond. Lyndon LaRouche always said he was making forecasts, not predictions. What's the difference?
Well, I think the answer lies in what I tried to touch upon in my earlier presentation. A forecast, includes a foreknowledge. It's a prescience, what Kusa calls the Vorwissen, that you already know what is the necessary outcome for a cause to succeed. In other words, you start with a positive conception yourself, and then you measure what is happening in reality that either it furthers that cause or it damages it. And that way you can actually make a forecast about the effect of an event or a trend or a tendency being absolutely guided by what you already know the necessary next step should be, as compared to a prediction, which I think is more belonging into the realm of statistics and linear thinking, that you project sort of trends, that you, even if you have complicated models, you project a trend. I would say that anything having to do with algorithms is, a prediction. It's a model. And we see right now in the case of all these climate models that they are completely arbitrary, that they are very, in the case of climate, very incomplete, because climate is much more complex, obviously, than even the most complicated algorithms. So I think the difference is that the forecasting, I would say, is a science, and prediction is sort of a trial and error.
And clearly, most recently, more error than trial by those who engage in this. Let me begin with questions and urge people to further send in questions to questions at LaRoucheLegacyFoundation.org. We're open for business, so definitely send them in. There have been a number of questions that have come in about one of the recurring themes in many of the presentations. And although the question is written to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, I'm going to invite not only her, but anyone else who would like to comment on this as well. It is from Adam Slowakowski, who says, my question is for Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Many commentators and analysts are saying that AI in the next few years will advance to such an extent that computerized robots will be able to take over so many areas of human employment, making many millions of people unemployed. What can be done to control the growth of AI so that it does not forever destroy human work and livelihood, but is tamed, so that the wonderful humanistic goal of full employment through rational manufacturing and infrastructure can be achieved for the benefit of all humanity?
Well, I think, in one sense, concerning AI applies what applies to all technological progress, that it tends to free men from manual labor, from muscle labor, that in former times, people had to work like oxen, and it was a big liberation that technologies would start to take over more and more those hard labors, even if it meant for a certain period of time that a certain section of the population would get unemployed. But, concerning AI, I think it's like with all technologies. The technology as such is not good or bad. It's a part of how the evolution of the mankind in the universe progresses. The big question is always, what is the quality of the human being who deploys that technology? And, one should be happy if there are more robots doing lots of works which are not productive. So be it. Then, let's have education programs so that all the people can be trained, can educate themselves into the most sophisticated areas, become more productive. So per se, that could have a big benefit. But if the intention of people employing AI is good, it has a tremendously good benefit, as we have seen in the ability, for example, of the Chinese to cope with the pandemic much, much better, simply because they have a much more integrated AI contact tracing, data evaluation about the disease and affected people, and since the Chinese population are 90% happy with what the Chinese government do, I would give them the credit of doubt that this is all being applied for the good of the people, contrary to the propaganda of the Western media, naturally. On the other side, there is a very worrisome discussion about, naturally it is good if there is a medical augmentation where organs and parts of the body function can be remedied. Like I was mentioning the Kurzweil reading machine, there are other medical augmentations for people who have who are disabled. So there can be an enormous benefit of it, but there's also a discussion about the use of AI and the merging of machines and the brain for a military application. And then I get really worried because, the military, again, it's not good or bad. Either you have the tradition of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, Lazare-Carnot, where the military is the officer is the model for society, the army is integrated with the society, and has actually a role as being a good example. Now that is a positive tradition which comes out of the Prussian reformers and certain traditions in France. But then, I read this horrible book by Samuel Huntington, The Soldier and the State, which is sort of the Bible of a certain section of, a certain section of the military-industrial complex in the United States. And they talk about increase of the killer ratio, making the soldier more efficient. And, so therefore, I just want to problematize these things. It is not the technology. The technology, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. It is the nature of human beings to always invent new ideas, new principles. But it is absolutely the question, who is the human being employing this? Is it a person employing these technologies for the common good? Then it's wonderful. But if it's used, to build a dictatorship, to build, like we see it right now with the Green Deal policy, an eco-dictatorship, which suppresses the development of the developing countries, then it is horrible. So I agree with Kraft-Ericke, the great rocket scientist, German-American rocket scientist, who was also a board member of the Schiller Institute, who said, he fully agrees you need the aesthetical education, Friedrich Schiller, all the other beautiful humanists, to make people more noble. So that is my short answer, and I think we have a tremendous challenge because that idea of making people beautiful characters, beautiful souls, of emphasizing what LaRouche, said is the essence of everything, love, agape, that is the most lacking right now. So I'm more worried about the lack of love than I'm worried about the growth of AI.
Okay. Would anyone else on the panel care to comment on this subject? Yes, Dr. Mikloško. One moment, please. We don't hear you. Just a moment. There we go. Okay. No, your microphone is muted, Dr. Mikloško. You need to turn your microphone on.
Yes. I told that I'm please not doctor, not professor, I'm Joseph. It's enough. It's enough. I want to underline that.
Thank you. Go right ahead.
I want to underline that Lynn very much emphasized knowledge of history, mathematician, it means also informatics, and classical music. It should be a little bit underlined today. And he also was very keen for Christianity, for God, for family, for children, for education, and so on. This idea should be not also forgotten. Secondly, artificial intelligence. It's a little bit not probably necessary to speak, but I tell it that I was 9 years coordinator of artificial intelligence in Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia. Therefore, we had a big task in many mathematician and informatics institutes. And we have also in Bratislava international basic laboratory for artificial intelligence. In 5 years, I was chief of this institute. In 5 years, 232 people about artificial intelligence from 12 in this time socialist countries were presented in Bratislava and studied and wrote. And after Velvet Revolution, it was, I'm sorry to tell it, but cancelled. But I'm not afraid of artificial intelligence. Of course, man is much more important, like artificial intelligence, but the many result, expert system, speech synthesis, analysis, of course, robotics is very important, but always must men be decisive force in this whole system. Therefore, it's very dangerous to let it for computer. This analysis, real-time analysis data, for example, from internet, when billion people are controlled and everybody knows what are tendency for them, for marketing, also our politics. It's very dangerous, and especially before election. In our country, maybe 2-3 times won people which really was not the best, but then we could know that they had this very expensive and important system for analysis of data on the influence of these people for election and for many other things. Therefore, artificial intelligence is only for help us, and of course, never can be better than men and then our brain, which is absolutely number one, and computer never can make the same thing like our brain.
I'd like to make an intervention if possible.
Sure, go right ahead, Kirk. Since we're now on a first name basis, thank you, Joseph, and Kirk, it's for you now.
Absolutely. Yes, this actually reminds me of once when I met, I think it was Richard Black, when I was in New Jersey at one point. He gave me a whole packet of old EIR issues and other documentation from the LaRouche movement and the LaRouche. Amazing stuff, amazing stuff. And one of the issues from, I believe, 1984, I wish I could remember the volume and issue number, and it was talking about the American system, but I was reading through other things in EIR, and Lyndon LaRouche had a critique of information technology theory, which in 84 is basically the same thing as what we're talking about, artificial intelligence. And he just had such a profound critique that has stuck with me forever since I read that, about why the whole basis of that school of thought, research, etc., is founded totally erroneously, because they have this information technology model that somehow information is put into the human brain like into a computer, like as if we have a disk or something plugging into our head and our brains are reading it, when that is not the case at all. Right now, there are sound waves going through electronic equipment, and there's no direct input of data into a hard drive that our brain is reading. It is a metaphysical process. And this is one of the flaws of AI theory, this idea that consciousness arises spontaneously from material. And the whole incorporation of metaphysics and the importance given to metaphysics, just like the ancient philosophers, it was crucial to ancient philosophy to integrate physics and metaphysics. And I think it really ties in to the questions asked to Helga earlier about forecasting versus prediction. And in my understanding, I would say that what I see in Lyndon LaRouche's work, and which I identify with very strongly, is with forecasting, and if I may paraphrase or phrase it in my own way, it's tied in to the idea of telos right? And this is a the Greek notion of telos, and this is a metaphysical notion that only the human soul can tap into to understand the non-linear aspects of development and growth, whereas the algorithm, the modeling and so forth is typical materialistic linear thinking that is totally different from the way the universe and the world and life actually unfolds, which only human consciousness can do. And so these are quintessentially LaRouchean ideas and concepts that I wanted to share.
Okay, very good. Great. Thank you, Kirk. I have a question here, which I'm sure many of you will have something to say about, and more questions are coming in. So this is something which I'm sure that Joseph will have things to say about, as will probably Yekaterina, and maybe Kirk as well. It is from Luis Moreno, and he says very simply the following, or asks, within LaRouche's economic postulates, what does he see as the fundamental difference between the economic vision of Marxism and neoliberalism? Does social Christian thought have a place within LaRouche's philosophy? So, who wants to go first? Marxism, neoliberalism, and Christian thought and the relationship to LaRouche's economy. Joseph, please turn on your microphone.
Yes.
There we go.
It's a difficult question, but good, very good question. It's a topic for conference or seminar. 3 words for question before: forecast or prediction. Lin had gift, talent from the God, that he understands the trend in politics, in culture, in social science, financial, economics in the world. Therefore, he could see 10, 20 years forward. And really, in this sense, he was like Old Testament prophets, that he told something, and really in years it was fulfilled. It was first by remarks like Ezekiel or Isaiah or others said something absolutely unusual, but it was good said. And about I think that today liberalism is like Marxism. It's out of future. We had 40 years Marxism, which was really very hard and very ideological, dangerous, economically absolutely bad. And we said enough. I'm very glad that today Marxism, Leninism is out of the today's important ideas. There are big mistakes if somebody says that Soviet Union from past is the same like Russian today. It's absolutely other things. Therefore, this should be also mentioned that also Russian has no more Marxism, Leninism, and other things. In Catholic Church, there is social teaching of the Church. There are many encyclicals of popes. 100 years, 1981 was 100 years of first social encyclical. It's 1991, pardon. Therefore, really, who study this, also not religion people, but there are many very important and good ideas for people from the streets, and also with this not only money, not only success, not only business and freedom, sense of without border, but also the third dimension is mentioned there, and social teaching of the church, like in our documents, our encyclicals are very important to study. Really, it's a good idea for today. Liberalism is absolutely out of this. It's another topic. I don't want to speak about it. We have now dangerous. The liberalism came a little bit near to the politics, but it's hopefully not the fact.
Okay, thank you. I have two specific questions for Yekaterina, which I'll ask in a moment. But first, Paul, I would like to ask if you have anything that you'd like to throw in on this topic now under discussion.
I think he's muted.
Paul, if you're speaking, you're muted.
Say again what you mean by this topic. If you mean Christianity and economics, or you mean...
Well, the topic of Marxism, liberalism, Christian economics, and LaRouche's system overall. It's a very broad subject, one for an entire seminar, as Joseph was just saying. But if you'd have something you want to throw in on this.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't mind saying a short thing on this. That Marxism and neoliberalism appear to be opposites, and at a certain level of analysis, perhaps they are. But fundamentally, they are both materialist philosophies and do not cater for the human soul, do not recognize the existence of the human soul. And so they suffer whatever differences they may have at a certain level of analysis, at a deeper level of analysis. They are absolutely similar in that they are focused on the material and not on, and do not incorporate the soul, whereas something like Christian democracy has a fuller view of humanity, of telos, of purpose, and that's, I think, a fundamental thing that we should keep in mind.
And in fact, what Nicholas of Cusa said, that mind is what gives life to the body, and that is why it is called soul. And I think that reflects a concept which is right at the center of LaRouche's economics as well. Let me ask two questions that have come in specifically for Yekaterina, which are the following. Could the Kuznetsov School of Science promote the introduction of the LaRouche, the La parameter, for LaRouche's potential relative population density? Could we hope that the Russian Academy of Sciences approve it? And is there some project to publish a study comparing the ideas of LaRouche and Dr. Kuznetsov? And again, I would remind you to turn your microphone on for your response and leave time for the interpreter. You need to turn your microphone on.
Спасибо за вопрос.
Thank you for the question.
Я попробую кратко на него ответить.
I will try to answer briefly.
Значит, внедрением единицы ла может ли школа способствовать? Для этого нам необходимо сделать ряд организационных мероприятий, значит, научных мероприятий.
The law union, the law measurement. So can this help? And for this, we have to organize certain.
Сегодня нам необходимо действительно в России на русском языке издать кратко главные идеи Линдона Ларуша для того, чтобы увеличить круг читателей, в том числе поддержку среди научного сообщества.
We do need to have a book in Russian covering all the ideas of Lyndon LaRouche, so that we will have a broader scope of support, especially from the scientific community.
убедить молодежь и разъяснить молодому поколению, в чем особенность взаимосвязи наших научных школ для внедрения идей Ларуша в практику.
And also to convince the young people, to explain to them how and why it's important to introduce and implement LaRouche's scientific and the scientific ideas of LaRouche and what our scientific schools have in common and how to put this into practice, what LaRouche's ideas are.
Среди ближайших шагов необходимо
And to take these steps in the foreseeable future, we need
заявить на базе Российской академии наук в комитет популяризации научного наследия.
For this, we need to, in the Russian Academy of Sciences, we need to apply to the Committee of Promotion of the Scientific Heritage Committee.
Совместный или доклад института для вообще озвучивания инициативы, которую вы сейчас предложили, которую мы плодотворно обсудили в российском научном и, может быть, международном сообществе.
In order to bring the initiative that we have been discussing just now and very effectively, very efficiently, to bring it to the knowledge of the Russian scientific community and probably also the international scientific community.
Я не вижу препятствий для того, чтобы продолжать развивать и внедрять единицу измерения в качестве альтернативной, и это востребовано среди наших политиков.
And I don't see why we would have any obstacles. I don't see any potential obstacles to implement, to introduce this measurement law in the scientific community and the political community.
Поэтому для внедрения нам просто необходимо составить план, организационный план нашей совместной работы.
For this, we just need to make a plan of our joint work.
Я надеюсь, я ответила на ваш вопрос.
And I hope this answered your question.
Если нет, то прошу уточнить.
And if not, I will ask you to be even more specific.
Thank you very much. I think the answer is very clear and very exciting because the prospects now we have not only Jozef's proposal for a little book on LaRouche in numerous languages, but also the idea of publishing more of LaRouche in Russian, some of which has already been published. This is exactly the kind of project that the LaRouche Legacy Foundation looks to promote. Now, we're running towards the end of our discussion period here, and I want you each to be thinking, if you would, about your closing comments. I'm going to first ask one question and then provide a broad question for each of you to make some final comments on. I think that this question from Ernest Shapiro perhaps is best directed to both Paul Gallagher and to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which is the following. Please discuss the relevance of LaRouche's science of physical economy as a new theory of knowledge. Also, perhaps discuss its relevance to understanding other living processes and its relationship to Plato's notion of higher hypothesis and a succession of Riemannian manifolds. That, too, sounds to me like a question meriting an entire course of study, at the very least, but I see what you can do with it. Paul, you want to go first?
I've been asked this question before. I had the same reaction that you did, that this is a day-long conference at least. And I wanted to ask, I wanted to raise something else in response to Ms. Shamayeva's last comment, and that is that both she and Dr. Vitrenko earlier, in different ways, are raising the question of a new international monetary system. We are talking about an event in 1971 of which LaRouche was uniquely able to be aware of its coming beforehand and what might happen. And since then, effectively, we have not had any international credit and monetary system. We've been living in a state of progressively increasing financial chaos as a result. Some people have discussed this. Now, it's obviously very important in answering that question that Dr. Vitrenko raised in particular, how to approach the return to fixed currency arrangements linked to a gold reserve, together with the implementation of bank reform, bank reorganization on the Glass-Steagall principle in every country participating, in order to really make credit flow for development. And I think that the issue of the law, as Kuznetsov coined that potential term, it goes to the heart of this question. It was dealt with in Lyndon LaRouche's very, very important paper written in 2000 called Trade Without Currencies, in which he addressed this question of how a new Bretton Woods could actually be set in motion and what the relationship of productivity and of currencies of the different major powers that would launch it, what they would be and where they would come from. And I think that the law, as a measure of energy flux density, and alternatively of relative potential population density, this is an essential part of the answer to that question. So I'm really just calling attention to that paper in 2000 of LaRouche, I think one of the most important and one of the most studyable papers that he's ever written, certainly on this subject. And it really goes to the basic question that we've been discussing in other ways as to whether there are simple trends, and we simply look at trends and project them, or whether we are aware of what is not in the trends, but should be. In other words, what the trends are about to hit, like a brick wall, and break up as a result. There's nothing more central to the difference between LaRouche's ability to forecast in writing, for example, the 1957 recession, its severity and its length, as opposed to then perhaps the most important economist in the United States, Arthur F. Burns, who was Eisenhower's chief of economic advisors in both of his terms, and then Federal Reserve chairman under Nixon. Burns had a model. It was a very famous and celebrated model of the business cycle in capitalist economies. And on the basis of that model and projecting the trends, he very proudly forecast a long and strong recovery from the 1954 recession, and sought to really aggrandize himself in the administration by that ability to predict this coming long and strong recovery, which of course hit a brick wall in 1957, and Lynn's ability to forecast it. So I'm just really raising that paper and that question, which I think Dr. Vitrenko also raised earlier. What will be the measure of productivity and of growth in real human productivity among the various nations that launch a new international credit and monetary system. That's very important.
Okay, very good. What I would like to do is ask the final question. We only have 5 minutes remaining on this panel, unfortunately, and it's a very hard limit. But I have a question which comes directly off Paul's remarks just now, a double question which has come in, and I would like each of you to formulate your brief final remarks as it relates to these matters. The question is there any prospect for a new Bretton Woods conference? How can we organize the United States and other countries to be part of it? And then the question, did Lyndon LaRouche have an empirical basis for measuring creativity? What is the relationship between that idea and his idea that genius can be taught? Can a nation encourage creativity with its policies? New Bretton Woods, creativity. So let's go around the table in conclusion. First, let me ask Joseph to speak.
To tell the truth, I did not quite understand your question. Maybe if the other will be, then I add something to it. But I want to underline the very important things. Today we have fantastic possibility to spread the good idea. Lyndon LaRouche was really generator of heavy and new ideas. And today, good idea can, in 3 minutes, reach all over the world. Then internet, Facebook, Twitter, blogs, there are new possibilities. I'm old man, but I have 1 million followers on the blogs, Instagram, and Facebook. Therefore, if I have good idea, then really 1 million people can read it very quickly. And secondly, this knowledge representation is really basic topic of artificial intelligence, and the main problem today is, for example, fluently speak recognition. Signal, image, also videos are clear practically. We have very good technology, which is over for the theory, but fluently speech recognition is complicated and not so today. Then sorry that this last question, which I did not understand quite, left for the other people.
That's okay. I'm sorry it wasn't clear, but let's proceed. Kirk, your brief response, for which you do need to turn your microphone on.
Not only I.
Sorry about that. Yeah, in terms of the new Bretton Woods, there's an objective necessity for it. However, the push to war, the Russophobia, the Sinophobia in the West is making that objective necessity very difficult, and so we must mobilize and overcome the hawks and the neocons and so forth. So that's a political project, I would have to say. In terms of creativity, that is so important, especially for small societies, small islands like us, and we are full of creativity. And the great thing about creativity is that it resides in the individual, and the individual could be, one person in a city of 10 million, or one person in a village or an island somewhere else, and this human creativity touches the entire humanity, and it is something that we must also concentrate on, and it links up to the other questions about Marxism and Christian science. That creativity is really part of the non-tangible, metaphysical part of human existence, and we almost always must take that into account.
Very good. Thank you, Kirk. Yekaterina, any brief concluding remarks?
Я хочу сказать, что мы с вами собрались для того, чтобы сохранить научное наследие. Но нельзя ничего сохранить, не изменив, не развив его. Так. Меня не переводят, нет?
Ой, алло?
Алло, да. Я хочу сказать, что мы с вами собрались для того, чтобы сохранить научное наследие Lyndon LaRouche. Но нельзя сохранить, не изменив, не развив его. Поэтому для того, чтобы провести новый Бреттон-Вудс, мы должны думать, какие новые возможности создать.
I believe that we're getting feedback through one of the open microphones. Maybe if everyone other than Yekaterina and the interpreter could be silenced. I'm sorry, please respond again.
So I would like to say that we are here to preserve and to promote the heritage of Lyndon LaRouche. And
связь между производительностью и творчеством людей.
And we cannot do this unless we utilize or we use the connection between the effectiveness and creativity of humans.
А мы с вами знаем, что вся история развития человечества – это и есть развитие его творческих способностей. Просто мы должны научиться, как нас учили, измерять эту взаимосвязь и эти возможности.
And we know that the whole history of humanity is the history of development of human creative abilities, and we need to learn to measure this connection between these possibilities.
Как заставить США принять участие в новой конференции по Бреттон-Вуду?
How do we make the United States to participate in the new conference on Bretton Woods?
Я убеждена, что никого заставить насильно нельзя. Многие правители думают, чтобы страна была счастливой, она должна быть большой, но это заблуждение.
I'm convinced that we cannot force anyone. And many think that for a country to be happy, that country has to be huge, which is a misconception.
Это не мои слова, это слова Аристотеля.
These are Aristotle's words, not mine.
Поэтому для того, чтобы мы все организовали эту конференцию, мы должны стать сильными, счастливыми людьми.
For us to organize such a conference, all we need is to be strong and happy as people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And given the time limitations, I would like to go directly to Helga for her concluding comments.
Well, I think the need for a new Bretton Woods system is extremely urgent. I mean, if I think about the, enormous sums of trillions which float around the globe every day in 7 days a week, 24 hours a day in nanosecond speed. This was what Bill Clinton had addressed I think it was in 87. 97. Whatever, this is what got him the impeachment because he dared to call for a new international architecture. And then they launched the Monica Lewinsky affair as an immediate reaction. Now, I happily remember that in that period, Natalia and I joined in calling for the convening of a new Bretton Woods system, which at that time was supported by, I think, hundreds and thousands of parliamentarians and other influentials. And I think this is very urgent because we have a hyperinflationary tendency, which is very visible, and it will not be temporary, as the Federal Reserve is trying to tell people. Hyperinflation is something, that once it's in the system, it tends to grow like in 1923 in Germany. So I think that discussion, to have a new Bretton Woods conference is extremely urgent. The G20 probably will not go for it. Maybe it has to be generated in some other circles and then gain momentum, because especially the developing countries have a lot to gain if there would be a new Bretton Woods system in the tradition of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and they have a lot to lose if the schemes of such people like Mark Carney would ever be fulfilled. Now, on the question of creativity, so I would suggest that out of this meeting, we may come up with a new call for such a Bretton Woods conference. And as the question of creativity, so sorry, Lynn had contact with thousands and tens of thousands of people in his life, all ranks from head of state, trade unionists, industrialists, students, fishermen in Peru, shoemakers in Italy. I mean, endless long lists of people. And I think what everybody appreciated about Lynn is that he sparked this spark of creativity, because just talking to this man, you would be lifted out of two-dimensionality into, the complexity of the real universe, and people would, respond. I think Lynn has made so many people's life more productive. For some, only a period of time, because they didn't have the stomach or stamina to stay with the cause. For others, it changed their whole life. And, we still find people all over the world say that, that Lynn changed their life by just opening their eyes and opening the spark of creativity. So I think that the goal of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, to spread his works in as many languages as possible, to conduct seminars more in depth than even this one, which was a sort of first start of the LLF, but to have a program of involving a real discussion about his ideas. I think we could really create a renaissance of beauty, of creativity, and, assembling a force of people who are determined to bring this world into a better era of civilization. So I would say, this work of this foundation can spark creativity of millions of people if we do our.
Thank you very much, Helga, and thank all the panelists for their contributions to this opening discussion of the LaRouche Legacy Foundation. This panel now concludes. The next one will initiate at exactly 1:30 p.m., 55 minutes from now. Thank you, and see you soon.